The dream always starts the same way. Jack Mercer is 23 years old again, standing in a trench that smells like copper and rotting vegetation. The sun is blinding white above Okinawa, and the heat makes the air shimmer like water. But Jack isn't the one in the trench. His grandfather is. Young Sam Mercer, 23, Marine Corps, first wave. Jack watches from somewhere outside himself, the way you do in dreams, as his grandfather crouches beside a dying Japanese soldier. The enemy's uniform is torn open, his chest a mess of red that spreads across the coral dust. Sam holds a canteen to the boy's lips. The boy is maybe 16. His eyes are dark and impossibly wide, and he's whispering something in a language Sam doesn't understand. Then the boy's hand moves, slow, deliberate, reaching for something at his belt. The grenade is dull green, American-made, probably taken from a dead Marine weeks earlier. Sam sees it. Time stretches. The boy's fingers curl around the metal. Sam's rifle comes up. The shot is loud enough to crack the sky open. The boy stops moving. The grenade rolls away, pin still intact. Sam stares at what he's done. Then he does something stranger. He searches the body, finds a photograph tucked in the boy's breast pocket, protected by oilcloth. A woman, 3 children. The youngest may be 4 years old. Sam takes the photograph, holds it. His hands are shaking. In the dream, Jack always wants to call out to his grandfather, to tell him it's okay, that he had no choice, that survival isn't a sin. But no sound comes out. Instead, the scene shifts. Now it's Jack in the trench. Afghanistan, not Okinawa. His son Matt is beside him, 22 years old, wearing desert camouflage instead of marine green. Matt turns to look at his father, and his eyes are the same as the Japanese boy's. Wide, knowing. Then the explosion comes. Jack woke at 4:47 in the morning to the sound of his own breathing. The alarm clock wouldn't ring for another 13 minutes, but his body no longer remembered how to sleep past dawn. The bedroom was cold. November in Nebraska had teeth, and the farmhouse had gaps in its bones that no amount of weather stripping could seal. He lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, waiting for his heart to remember it was safe. The dream was fading, but its residue clung to him like smoke. He reached for the nightstand, his hand moving automatically toward the photograph in the dark. Karen, his wife, dead 4 years now, pancreatic cancer, 6 months from diagnosis to grave. She smiled at him from behind dusty glass, forever 48, forever healthy, forever disappointed that he hadn't fought harder to keep them afloat. Next to her photo was another, Matt, Army Sergeant Matthew Mercer, killed in Kandahar Province, 2011, by an IED that left nothing big enough to send home in a flag-draped box. His son had been 34. Jack was 52 now. He'd outlived his boy by 18 years and counting. The mathematics of loss never made sense. He swung his legs out of bed, his knees popping like kindling. The hardwood floor was ice against his bare feet. He dressed in the dark, pulling on the same Carhartt jacket he'd worn for 15 years. The same Red Wing boots he'd resold 3 times because new ones cost $200, and pride was cheaper than leather. In the kitchen, he made coffee with hands that shook just slightly, a tremor that had nothing to do with cold and everything to do with the bottle in the cabinet he no longer opened. 3 years sober, 3 years of white-knuckling his way through every sunset, every holiday, every moment the silence got too loud. The coffee was black and bitter. He drank it standing at the window, looking out at land his family had worked for 4 generations. 680 acres of Nebraska topsoil, half of it lying fallow now, because he couldn't afford seed, couldn't afford fuel, couldn't afford to hire help or fix the equipment that kept breaking down like old men at a funeral. The John Deere in the barn was a 1987 model, forest green with rust blooming at the seams. Its transmission was dying. 3rd gear slipped and 2nd gear ground like stones in a can. A new tractor cost $60,000 minimum. A used one cost $30,000. Jack had $412 in his checking account. The heifers in the north pasture were thin. He'd started with 200 head back when Matt was alive, and the farm was a functioning operation. Now there were 34, and he couldn't afford to feed them through winter, couldn't afford to breed them, couldn't afford the vet bills when they got sick. Every week he sold another 2, taking whatever price the buyer offered because negotiation required leverage and leverage required options. He had none. He worked the farm alone. Had for 8 years. No hired hands, no seasonal help, no neighbors stopping by to share equipment or trade labor. People in town had learned to leave Jack Mercer alone the way you leave a wounded animal alone, with pity and distance and the unspoken understanding that nothing you say will help. The sun rose without enthusiasm, turning the sky from black to gray to a pale, sickly yellow. Jack finished his coffee, rinsed the cup, and left it in the sink beside yesterday's cup and the day before's. The dishes could wait. Everything could wait. He'd learned that nothing stops working just because you stop caring. He pulled on a pair of work gloves that were more hole than glove, grabbed the toolbox from the porch, and walked to the barn. The morning was so quiet he could hear his own heartbeat in his ears. No radio, no phone, no human voice but his own. And he'd stopped talking to himself years ago when he realized it only made the silence more obvious. The tractor started on the third try, coughing black smoke that hung in the cold air like a bad omen. He let it idle for 10 minutes, listening to the engine's rough rhythm, counting the misfires, and calculating in his head how much longer it would last. A month, maybe 2. Then it would die for good, and with it, any pretense that he was still farming instead of just going through motions. At 9:15, his phone rang. The sound was so unexpected that Jack stared at the device for 3 rings before answering. The number was local, Kearney, Nebraska. He didn't recognize it, but he answered anyway because the alternative was letting it ring and wondering. The voice on the other end was old and rough, like tires on gravel. Frank Dalton, attorney at law, executor of estates, Sam Mercer's only friend. Jack hadn't spoken to Frank in 6 years, not since the last time he tried to visit his grandfather and been turned away at the door by a man who valued solitude more than blood. Frank didn't waste time on pleasantries. He said Sam was dead. Heart attack. 3 days ago, died alone in that house he'd built from dirt and stubbornness. The one everyone in town laughed at. The one that looked like a bad decision calcified into architecture. Jack said nothing for a long time. The phone pressed against his ear felt heavy, like a stone. He should feel something, he thought, grief, relief, guilt. But all he felt was a dull, spreading numbness, the way you feel when you cut yourself but the blood hasn't started flowing yet. Frank asked if he could come into town. There were papers to sign, estate business. Jack was the sole heir, Frank explained, though the words came out careful and weighted, like Frank knew they were both thinking the same thing. Sole heir to what? A crazy old man's dirt pile? Jack said he'd be there in an hour. He hung up without saying goodbye. The drive to Kearney took 40 minutes on empty roads that cut through land as flat as a promise no one intended to keep. Jack passed farms that used to belong to neighbors, now swallowed up by corporate operations with $100,000 combines and center pivot irrigation systems that cost more than his house. The town itself was small enough that everyone knew everyone's business, and big enough that they could pretend they didn't. He drove past the Mercer Feed and Grain, a building that still bore his family's name, even though it had been foreclosed and sold in 2003, back when his father's debts finally outran his father's pride. The sign was faded but legible. Some ghosts don't have the decency to disappear. He stopped for gas at the Pump and Go on Route 44. The attendant was a kid, maybe 19, with acne and a name tag that said Trevor. Trevor didn't look at mine while he rang up the fuel, just stared at the register screen like it held secrets. But when Jack turned to leave, he heard the whisper behind him. 2 old-timers sitting by the coffee station, farmers by the look of their caps and the red dirt under their nails. That's Jack Mercer, poor bastard, lost everything. His grandpa was crazier than he is. That mud shack still standing? Ought to bulldoze it. Jack kept walking. He'd learned a long time ago that defending yourself to people who've already made up their minds was like arguing with the barbed wire. You just end up bleeding. Frank Dalton's office was above the hardware store on Main Street, up a narrow flight of stairs that creaked under Jack's weight. The door at the top was frosted glass with gold lettering that had started to peel. Frank Dalton, attorney, estate planning and wills. Jack knocked once and entered. Frank was behind his desk, 70 years old if he was a day, wearing a short-sleeved dress shirt in a bolo tie that had gone out of style before Jack was born. His face was all angles and sun damage, the kind of face that came from living through Korea and deciding the world didn't owe you anything except the chance to work until you died. He stood when Jack entered, shook his hand with a grip that still had strength in it, and gestured to a chair that looked older than both of them. Sam died 3 days ago, Frank said again, as if repetition made it real. Heart attack. He was 94. At that age, the heart just decides it's done, no warning, no goodbye. The medical examiner said it was quick. Jack nodded. He tried to summon a memory of his grandfather that felt warm, something he could hold on to that might justify grief. But all he had were fragments. Sam at family gatherings, standing at the edge of rooms, watching people with eyes that never quite seemed to land on anything. Sam refusing help, refusing conversation, refusing to explain why he lived the way he lived. Jack remembered being 12, riding his bike out to the Earthbag house on a dare from friends, trying to look tough and unafraid. Sam had come out onto the porch, tall and stooped, and stared at Jack for a full minute without saying a word. Then he'd turned and gone back inside, locking the door behind him. Jack had pedaled home feeling like he'd done something wrong, though he couldn't say what. Frank slid a folder across the desk. The documents inside were simple. Last will and testament. Sam had left everything to Jack. Everything, Frank repeated, though his voice carried a note that might have been pity or warning. Jack opened the folder and scanned the pages. 22 acres of land on the eastern edge of the county, accessible only by a dirt road that washed out every spring. One structure of indeterminate value described in the legal language as an earthbag dwelling, non-conforming to county residential codes. Status unclear. No cash, no savings accounts, no vehicles. Just land in that house. Jack looked up at Frank. That's it? Frank leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. That's what's on paper. But Sam was a complicated man. There might be more. You'll need to go through the property yourself. Make sure there's nothing worth keeping before you decide what to do with it. What would I do with it? Jack asked. The question wasn't rhetorical. He genuinely had no idea. Most people tear it down, Frank said. Sell the land. It's not worth much, but it's worth something. 22 acres of unimproved rural property. You might get 35,000 if you find the right buyer. Jack thought about $35,000. It wouldn't save the farm. The bank was demanding $890,000 to clear the accelerated loan they'd forced on him 2 years ago when commodity prices crashed and he'd missed 3 payments in a row. But $35,000 might buy him time. Another few months, maybe half a year. Time to figure out what came next, if anything came next. I'll think about it, Jack said. Frank nodded. He opened a drawer in his desk and pulled out a single brass key attached to a dog tag chain. The key was old, the kind that belonged to locks made before people worried about security. The dog tag was military issue, stamped with letters worn smooth by decades of handling. S. Mercer, 1st Marines, Okinawa, 1945. He told me to give you this, Frank said, holding the key out across the desk. Told me you'd know where to find the stone. Jack took the key. The metal was cool against his palm, and the weight of it felt heavier than it should. He turned it over, examining the dog tag, tracing the letters with his thumb. His grandfather had carried this through the worst fighting in the Pacific, had carried it home, had carried it for 79 years. Why did he keep this? Jack asked, though he wasn't sure if he was asking Frank or himself. Frank didn't answer right away. He stared at Jack for a long moment, his eyes narrowed, like he was deciding how much truth to tell. Sam did not talk much, Frank said finally. But once, years ago, he told me that some men carry the war in their bodies, and some carry it in their pockets. He said the dog tag reminded him who he used to be, back before he learned what he was capable of. Jack felt something cold settle in his chest. He knew that feeling, had lived with it since Matt died. The knowledge that you're capable of surviving things that should kill you, and that survival doesn't feel like victory, just like failure in slow motion. He stood, folding the documents and sliding them into his jacket pocket. The key and dog tag went into the other pocket, where they clinked softly against his truck keys. Frank stood too. He walked Jack to the door but stopped him before he could leave. Jack, Frank said, his voice lower now, almost careful. Sam was my friend, one of the only men I've ever respected without reservation. He did things most people wouldn't understand, lived the way he lived for reasons he never explained. But I'll tell you this, he wasn't crazy. Whatever you find out there in that house, whatever you think when you see it, remember that. He wasn't crazy. Jack nodded, though he wasn't sure he believed it. Crazy was subjective. His grandfather had spent 50 years living in a house made of burlap sacks and dirt, shunned by his community, alone by choice. If that wasn't crazy, it was close enough that the difference didn't matter. He drove out to the property that afternoon, taking the long way through town so he'd have time to steel himself. The road to Sam's land was exactly as bad as Jack remembered, rutted and overgrown, barely wide enough for his truck. Trees pressed in on both sides, cottonwoods and scrub oak that hadn't been trimmed in decades. The land here was scrubland, too rocky and irregular for farming, good for nothing except holding dirt in place and maybe grazing a few cattle if you were desperate. The road curved once, twice, and then opened into a clearing. And there it was, the Earthbag house. Jack stopped the truck 50 feet away and just stared. He'd seen it before, of course, but always from a distance, always in passing. Up close, it looked worse. The structure was low and hunched, barely taller than a man at its highest point. The walls were made from burlap sacks, thousands of them, stacked and layered like bricks, filled with dirt, and sealed with some kind of mud plaster that had darkened over the years to a mottled black and brown. Time and weather had been unkind. Sections of the wall had sagged. The roof, which appeared to be more burlap sacks covered with tar paper and sheet metal, looked like it might collapse under the weight of the next snow. Dead grass grew in thick clumps around the foundation. The windows were narrow slits, barely 6 inches tall, set low into the walls like the eyes of something half buried. There was a door, thick wood, scarred and sun-bleached, sitting crooked in its frame. A hand-painted sign hung beside the door. The wood so weathered the letters were almost illegible. Private property. Keep out. S. Mercer. Jack sat in the truck with the engine idling, his hand still on the steering wheel. He tried to imagine his grandfather building this place, tried to picture the old man hauling bags of dirt, stacking them one by one year after year, alone out here with nothing but his thoughts and whatever ghost followed him home from the war. It must have taken years, a decade, maybe more. And for what? To live like a mole? To hide from a world that had already forgotten him? Jack turned off the engine. The silence that followed was absolute. No wind, no birds, no distant traffic. Just the ticking of the cooling engine and the sound of his own breath. He climbed out of the truck, boots crunching on gravel, and stood there for a moment, looking at the house. It looked back at him with its narrow windows, impassive and patient, like it had been waiting for him all along. Frank had said the key would be under a stone on the east side. Jack walked around the perimeter, scanning the ground. The earth was hard-packed and littered with rocks, but one stood out, flat, gray, roughly the size of a dinner plate. He crouched beside it and saw the faint carving on its surface. SM 1975, the year his grandfather moved into this place permanently, 6 years after Jack's father died in Vietnam. Jack lifted the stone. Beneath it was a shallow depression in the dirt, and in that depression lay a brass key identical to the one Frank had given him. Jack picked it up, brushed the dirt off, and stood. 2 keys, one for the lawyer, one for the grandson. Sam had planned for this moment, had anticipated that someday someone would come looking. Jack walked back to the door. Up close, he could see that it was more solid than it appeared. The wood was thick, old-growth pine, the kind they didn't mill anymore. 3 deadbolts ran down the edge, heavy-duty, the kind you'd use on a safe room or a bunker. Jack inserted the key into the top lock. It turned smoothly, the mechanism well-oiled despite the years. The second lock, the third, each opened with a soft click that sounded loud in the stillness. He paused with his hand on the door handle. Some part of him, the part that still believed in omens and last chances, wanted to turn around, to get back in his truck and drive away, to let the house stand here undisturbed, a monument to a man he never understood and never would. But he'd come this far, and $35,000 was $35,000. He pushed the door open. It swung inward silently, hinges oiled and smooth, and a breath of air rushed out to meet him. Cool, dry, carrying the scent of earth and something else, something like old leather and gun oil. Jack stepped across the threshold. The interior was darker than the afternoon outside, his eyes needing a moment to adjust. But as they did, he stopped moving entirely, because the inside of the house was nothing like the outside. The floor was packed earth, but not rough or uneven. It was smooth, almost polished, hard as concrete and perfectly level. The walls were burlap sacks on the outside, but on the inside they were lined with cedar planks, tongue and groove fitted so tightly there were no gaps. The space was a single room, maybe 24 feet by 30, but it was organized with a precision that bordered on obsessive. Against the far wall was a cot, military issue, made with corners so tight you could bounce a quarter off the blanket. Beside the cot was a footlocker, olive drab, stenciled with his grandfather's name and service number. Shelves ran along the north wall, floor to ceiling, every shelf packed with items arranged in perfect order. Glass jars filled with nails, sorted by size. Cans of food, labels facing out. Tools hung on pegboards, each one outlined in marker so you'd know exactly where it belonged. Lanterns, books, a cast iron skillet, everything squared away like a barracks inspection. The south wall held a small table and a single wooden chair. On the table were reading glasses, a magnifying glass, and a newspaper, folded neatly, dated 3 days ago, the day Sam died. A calendar hung beside the table, the kind with tear-away pages. Every day from January 1st to the present had been X'd out in blue ink. The final X was November 18th, yesterday. Jack stood in the center of the room, turning slowly, taking it all in. This wasn't the lair of a madman. This was the home of a soldier, a man who'd learned in war that chaos killed you, that discipline kept you alive, and that order was the only thing standing between sanity and the abyss. He walked to the footlocker, knelt beside it, and lifted the lid. Inside was his grandfather's Marine Corps uniform, olive green wool, cleaned and pressed and folded with parade ground precision. Beneath the uniform were medals in a small wooden box: Bronze Star, Purple Heart, Combat Action Ribbon. Letters tied with string addressed to Mary Mercer, Jack's grandmother. She died in 1967, 3 years before Jack was born. Sam had kept her letters for 57 years. Jack closed the footlocker gently, feeling like an intruder in a space that didn't belong to him. He stood and moved to the shelves. 17 leather-bound ledgers sat on the top shelf, each one numbered in gold leaf on the spine. 1975 to 2024. 50 years of record-keeping. 50 years of something. Jack pulled down the first ledger, carried it to the table, and opened it. The handwriting inside was small and precise, each line ruler straight, each letter formed with the same mechanical consistency. Dates ran down the left margin, names beside them, amounts, terms, interest rates, witness signatures. This wasn't a diary, it was a loan book, a record of debts given and debts owed. Jack scanned the first page. March 1975, Robert Henshaw, $5,000, spring planting, bank refused, repaid 1978, full amount plus interest. Honorable man, April 1975, Catherine Wu, $3,000, medical bills, husband's accident, repaid 1977, no interest accepted, grateful, June 1975, Michael Brennan, $8,000, equipment purchase, repaid 1980s, late but honest, page after page, year after year. His grandfather had been a lender, a private bank for people the real banks wouldn't touch, farmers in crisis, families with emergencies, people who needed help and had nowhere else to turn. And Sam had helped them, had given them money, had taken their promises, had waited for repayment. Most of them had paid him back, but not all. Jack flipped through the ledger, scanning names, watching the pattern emerge. Some entries were marked repaid in full, others said partial payment. A few, maybe 1 in 10, said something else. Contact refused, legal action declined. Waiting. Jack's hands started to shake. He set the first ledger aside and pulled down the sixth, 1989. He flipped through the pages, his heart starting to pound in a way that had nothing to do with exertion. And then he found it. March 17th, 1989. Clayton Burgess, $85,000. Spring planting. Bank refused after father's death. Collateral, 180 acres, Section 14, Township 9. Terms, repay within 10 years, 5% simple interest. Witness, Thomas Burgess, deceased 1994. Below the entry were status updates, added over the years in the same careful handwriting, 1989 to 1994. Promises, delays, excuses. 1995, refused contact. 1998, threatened legal action against me. Ironic. 2005, now wealthy, still refuses, waiting. 2024, he thinks I forgot. I remember everything. USMC. Jack stared at the page. Clayton Burgess, his best friend from childhood, best man at his wedding, the man who'd betrayed him in 2012, who'd bought Jack's land for pennies on the dollar when Karen was dying and Jack was drowning in medical bills. Clayton, who now owned the biggest farm in the county, who sat on the town council, who drove a $70,000 truck and lived in a house with a 3-car garage. Clayton owed Sam $85,000, plus 35 years of interest. Jack did the math in his head. Compound interest at 5%. That debt was worth over $300,000 now, maybe more. And Clayton had never paid a dime. Jack's vision started to blur at the edges. He set the ledger down carefully, afraid he might tear the pages if he held it any tighter. His breathing was shallow and fast. He stood and walked to the door, needing air, needing space, needing anything but the 4 walls of this room that suddenly felt like they were closing in. He stepped outside into the late afternoon light. The sun was lower now, casting long shadows across the clearing. The cold air hit his face and helped clear his head. He leaned against the doorframe and stared at nothing, trying to process what he'd just learned. His grandfather hadn't been crazy. He'd been calculating. He'd helped people, yes, but he'd also documented every transaction, every promise, every betrayal. He'd been a lender, a record keeper, a man who understood that trust was a currency and memory was a weapon. Jack thought about Clayton, about the way he'd smiled when he'd offered to help Jack during Karen's illness, about the contract Jack had signed, desperate and grateful, not realizing until months later that he'd sold 120 acres for $40,000 when it was worth 3 times that. About the way Clayton had looked at him when Jack confronted him, the way he'd shrugged and said, "Business is business, Jack. You were desperate. I helped." Jack pushed off the doorframe and went back inside. He pulled down more ledgers. 1998, 2003, 2006. More names, more debts. And as he read, a pattern emerged that made his chest tighten with something that felt like rage but burned colder. Richard Voss. $12,000, 1998. The same Richard Voss who was now a loan officer at First National Bank. The same man who'd sat across a desk from Jack and told him he had 60 days to come up with $890,000 or lose everything. Voss had never repaid Sam. The ledger said, contact refused 2001, legal threats 2004, wrote off as lost 2010, but not forgotten. Mayor Andrew Kern, $45,000 2003, never repaid. Dr. Helen Strauss, $38,000 1987, partial payment only. Wade Holland Sr., $22,000 refused after election as sheriff. Margaret Chen, $8,000 2001. Then a note beside her name different from the others. Repaid 2003, full amount. Returned funds through church donation anonymously. Good woman. Kids needed college more than I needed money. Frank Dalton, $15,000 1982. The ledger showed payments through 92. A final entry that said, paid in full, honorable man. Only one who kept his word without being asked. Father Thomas Quinn, $28,000 1979. Catholic Church Building Fund. Repaid 1985. Man of God proved it. Jack counted 7 names that had never paid. 7 people who owed his grandfather a combined total of over $200,000. People who'd taken Sam's help when they needed it, then turned their backs when the time came to repay. People who were now wealthy, respected, powerful. People who'd probably spent the last 30 years assuming Sam was too crazy or too weak to collect. They were wrong. Sam had collected, just not in the way they expected. He'd collected information. He'd collected records. He'd collected evidence. And now he had left it all to Jack. Jack sat at the table as the light outside faded to dusk. He didn't turn on the lantern. He sat in the growing dark, his hands flat on the scarred wood, the ledger stacked beside him like evidence at a trial. His grandfather had given him a weapon. The question was what to do with it. The bank was going to foreclose on his farm in 60 days. Clayton Burgess alone owed enough to clear that debt and have money left over. Add the others, and Jack could save the farm, rebuild, maybe even expand. All he had to do was collect what was owed. All he had to do was take what was his by right. But there was something else. Something in the way Sam had written those entries. The precision, the patience, the fact that he'd tracked these debts for decades without ever pursuing them. Sam had been waiting for something or someone. Jack stood and walked to the north wall. He ran his hand along the cedar paneling, feeling for seams, for anything that didn't belong. The wood was smooth and cold, but there, near the corner where the north wall met the west, one panel sat slightly proud of the others. A quarter inch, no more. Easy to miss unless you were looking. Jack pressed it. Nothing happened. He pressed harder. The panel clicked and swung inward on hidden hinges, revealing a hollow space behind the wall. Inside the hollow was a metal safe, military gray, combination lock, serious hardware. Taped to the front of the safe was a note, written in Sam's handwriting on a piece of paper that had yellowed with age. Your birthday, Jack. The day your mother was born. 05/17/1972. Jack's hands were shaking again as he spun the dial. 5/17/72. The lock clicked. The handle turned. The safe door swung open. Inside were two steel boxes, each about the size of a shoebox, in a sealed envelope with Jack's name written across the front. Jack pulled out the first box. It was heavier than it looked. He set it on the table, lifted the lid, and froze. Money. Stacks of $50 bills, bundled with paper bands, each band labeled in Sam's handwriting. The first bundle said C. Burgess, 1989 to 2024. Principal plus compound interest. Jack counted. 40 bundles. $2,000 per bundle. $80,000. The second box held more cash, divided into smaller bundles, each labeled with a different name. 7 names. 7 debts. Total, $53,000. Combined, the two boxes held $133,000 in cash. Enough to save the farm. Enough to start over. Enough to prove that Sam hadn't been waiting for nothing. He'd been waiting for this. For Jack. For the moment when his grandson would need this money badly enough to open the safe. Badly enough to step into the role Sam had left for him. Jack picked up the envelope. The paper was thick, expensive, the kind you use for important documents. He broke the seal and pulled out a single sheet of paper, covered front and back in his grandfather's precise handwriting. The letter wasn't long, but every word hit like a stone. To whoever opens this safe, if you are reading this, I am dead. Good. I have held this burden long enough. The money here represents debts owed to me, legal debts, documented debts, not gifts, not charity, contracts signed, terms agreed upon, witnesses present. I helped men when banks would not. I asked for repayment. They refused. I did not pursue because I understood something that war taught me. Patience is a weapon. Silence is armor. Loud men die first. I have carried these debts for decades. I could have taken them to court, could have seized property, could have destroyed the men who betrayed my trust. But I did not. Because taking what you are owed and becoming what you hate are separated by a line so thin most men cross it without noticing. You will be tempted to take this money and to do it loudly, to confront these men, to demand justice, to make them pay in ways that go beyond money. Do not, or do. The choice is yours. But understand this. If you choose noise, it will answer you in kind. These men have spent years building power. They will not give it up quietly. They will fight. They will lie. They will try to destroy you the way they thought they destroyed me. If you fight them their way, you will win the battle and lose yourself. I know this because I fought my war their way. I killed men who were trying to kill me. I survived when others did not. And I came home to discover that survival is not the same as living. The house you are standing in is not a joke. It is not madness. It is a fortress built to keep the world out and the war inside. I lived here for 50 years because out here, no one could make me loud. No one could make me forget what I learned in the Pacific. That discipline is survival. That patience outlasts rage. That the quiet man is the one still standing when the shouting stops. You have a choice to make. Take the money and fight loud, or take the money and fight quiet. One will give you satisfaction. The other will give you a future. Choose carefully. You cannot unfire a bullet. One more thing. I kept duplicate records. Safety deposit box at First National. Box 447, key with Frank Dalton. If anyone tries to destroy what I built here, the backup survives. Let them know that if you need to, but only if you need to. Semper Fidelis. Your grandfather, Samuel Mercer, USMC 1st Marines. Jack read the letter 3 times. Then he folded it carefully and set it back on the table beside the cash. The final paragraph about duplicate records changed everything. Sam hadn't just been careful. He'd been strategic. Military planning, redundancy, anticipating enemy action. Jack sat down in the wooden chair, his grandfather's chair, and stared at the steel boxes full of money that represented decades of betrayal and decades of patience. Outside, full dark had fallen. The house was silent. The world was silent. And for the first time in 8 years, Jack Mercer felt something other than numbness. He felt rage, cold, focused, patient. The kind of rage that doesn't shout or break things, the kind that waits. He looked around the Earthbag house, seeing it now not as a monument to madness, but as exactly what his grandfather had said. A fortress, a place built to survive, a place where a man could plan without interference, think without noise, decide without pressure. Jack had spent 3 years trying to stay sober, trying to keep the farm alive, trying to find a reason to wake up every morning when the only people he'd ever loved were dead. He'd failed at all of it, but maybe that was because he'd been trying to do it their way. The bank's way, the town's way, Clayton Burgess's way. Loud, desperate, reactive. His grandfather had offered him a different path, quiet, disciplined, strategic. The money in the boxes was a tool, not a solution. The question wasn't whether to take it. The question was how to use it. And sitting there in the dark, in a house made of earth and time, and the patience of a man who'd survived Okinawa, Jack began to understand what his grandfather had been trying to teach him. The inheritance wasn't the money. The inheritance was the choice. And Jack Mercer, for the first time since his son's funeral, knew exactly what he was going to do. Jack spent the night in the Earthbag house, not because he intended to, but because somewhere around midnight, he realized he had nowhere else he wanted to be. The farmhouse was cold and empty, filled with ghosts he'd been avoiding for years. Here, surrounded by his grandfather's meticulous order, the silence felt different, purposeful, earned. He made coffee on a camp stove he found on one of the shelves, the propane tank still half full, the burner working perfectly despite years of disuse. Sam had maintained everything, even the things no one would ever see, even the things that didn't matter. Except they did matter. That was the point. Jack sat at the wooden table as the first gray light of dawn filtered through the narrow windows, and he read. Ledger after ledger, year after year, the entries painted a picture of a community he thought he knew, but the picture was different from this angle. Darker, more complicated, more human. His grandfather had been a lender of last resort for 30 years. When the farm crisis hit in the 80s and banks were foreclosing on operations that had been in families for generations, Sam had stepped in, quietly, without fanfare. He'd lent money to 17 families between 1980 and 1985 alone. Some had repaid quickly. Others had taken years. A few had never paid at all, but those were the minority. Most people, Jack discovered, tried to do right when given the chance. It was only when they succeeded and decided their success had nothing to do with the help they'd received that the problem started. Clayton Burgess wasn't the only one, but he was the worst. Jack found the full accounting in Ledger 8, the years 1999 to 2000. Clayton's father, Thomas Burgess, had died in 1994, leaving Clayton a farm with more debt than land. The bank had refused to extend credit. Clayton was 32 years old, married with two infant daughters, staring at bankruptcy and the loss of everything his family had built over 4 generations. Sam had lent him $85,000. No bank would have touched that deal. The collateral was underwater, the risk absurd, the chances of repayment slim. But Sam had done it anyway, and the ledger showed why. Thomas Burgess had served in Korea, had been in Sam's unit for 6 months before taking his shrapnel to the leg and getting sent home. The note beside Clayton's entry said simply, "His father saved my life at Chosin Reservoir. I owed Thomas this. His son does not remember debts the way his father did." Jack traced the words with his finger, feeling the indentation where his grandfather's pen had pressed hard into the paper. The bitterness in that final sentence was palpable. Clayton had taken the money, had planted that spring, had harvested in the fall, had survived. And then, slowly, year by year, he'd stopped returning Sam's calls, stopped acknowledging the debt. By 998, according to the ledger, Clayton had threatened to sue Sam for harassment. The irony wasn't lost on Jack. The man who owed the money threatening the man who'd lent it. But Sam hadn't fought, hadn't taken Clayton to court, hadn't seized the collateral land that was legally his. He'd simply noted the betrayal in his precise handwriting and moved on. Waiting. Always waiting. Jack closed the ledger and opened another. 1998 to 2003. This one contained Richard Voss. The entry was dated April 14th, 1998. Richard Voss, $12,000, medical emergency, daughter's surgery, insurance denied, bank refused personal loan. The note beside it said, "He wept when I gave him the check, said he'd repay me within 2 years. He was wrong about the timeline." The repayment schedule showed Voss had made 3 payments in '99, totaling $1,800. Then nothing. The ledger tracked Sam's attempts at contact. 2000, no response to letters. 2001, phone disconnected. 2002, threatened restraining order if I continued to pursue. Jack felt his jaw tighten. Voss's daughter had lived. The surgery had been successful. Voss had gone on to get a job at First National Bank, had worked his way up from teller to loan officer, had probably made more in annual salary than he'd owed Sam in total, and he'd never paid back the man who'd saved his daughter's life. Now that same Richard Voss sat in an office with a bronze nameplate on his desk and told desperate farmers like Jack that the bank couldn't help them. That 60 days was all the extension they could offer. That business was business, and sentiment didn't count as equity. Jack wondered if Voss ever thought about the $12,000. If he ever lay awake at night remembering the man who'd helped him when no one else would. Probably not. People had a remarkable capacity for forgetting kindness once the crisis passed. By noon, Jack had read through 12 ledgers. His eyes ached from the small handwriting, and his hands were shaking from too much coffee and not enough food. But he couldn't stop. Each entry was a story, each name a small betrayal or a small redemption. Some patterns emerged that surprised him. Margaret Chen, who owned the Chen family grocery on Main Street, had borrowed $8,000 in 2001 after her husband was killed in a car accident. She'd needed money to keep the store running, to feed her 3 kids, to survive the winter when insurance payments got tied up in legal disputes. The ledger showed she'd repaid the full amount by 2003. But beside her final payment, Sam had written something different from his usual notes. Payment received. Returned funds through anonymous donation to St. Catherine's Building Fund, designated for Chen family. Woman too proud to accept charity. Kids needed college money more than I needed repayment. Good people still exist. Jack had sat back in his chair, staring at that entry. His grandfather had given Margaret Chen $8,000. She'd repaid it, probably scraping together every spare dollar for 2 years to honor the debt. And Sam had given it back to her without her knowing. Had made sure her kids could go to college. Had done it anonymously so she wouldn't feel diminished. That was the kind of man Sam Mercer had been. The kind who helped twice. The kind who understood that pride mattered as much as money. Jack found another entry like that. An old farmer named Robert Haskins borrowed $6,000 in 1987 for seed after a hailstorm destroyed his spring planting. Repaid it in full by 1989. Sam's note: Haskins paid back more than he owed. Refused to accept the overpayment. Told me to use it for the next man who needed it. I did. The world has fewer Haskins than it needs. But not every story was redemptive. Helen Strauss had borrowed $38,000 in 1987 to start her medical practice in Kearney. The town had been desperate for a doctor, the hospital 40 miles away, the nearest clinic even farther. Sam had lent her the money at 2% interest, half of what a bank would have charged, with a repayment schedule spread over 10 years. She'd made payments for 3 years, then stopped. The ledger showed Sam's attempts at contact. All ignored. By 1990, Dr. Strauss had paid back only $11,000 of the $38,000 she owed. The final note beside her name said, "Practice thriving. New clinic built 1994. Drives a Mercedes. Still owes $27,000. Will not acknowledge debt or return calls." Her Hippocratic oath apparently does not extend to financial promises. Jack knew Dr. Strauss. Everyone in the county did. She was the doctor who treated Karen during her final months. Professional, competent, cold. She told Jack that pancreatic cancer was always terminal, that chemotherapy would only buy time and reduce quality of life, that he should consider hospice care sooner rather than later. She'd been right, but her bedside manner had all the warmth of a credit card statement. Now Jack understood why. Deshawn Strauss had built her success on borrowed money she'd never repaid. She drove a car worth more than some people's houses. She lived in a place with a view of the river and probably never thought about the man who'd made her career possible. Wade Holland Sr.'s entry was shorter. $22,000, 1995, campaign fund for sheriff election, personal loan, no collateral. The note beside it was bitter. Elected sheriff, 1996. First act in office. Declined to investigate complaints against men who owed me money. Second act, threatened me with harassment charges if I continued to collect debts. The law protects the lawless. Nothing changes. Wade Sr. had died in 2018. His son, Wade Jr., was now a deputy in the same sheriff's department. Jack had met him once 3 years ago when someone had reported Jack's truck swerving on Route 44. Jack had been sober that day, just tired, but Deputy Wade had pulled him over anyway. Had made him do a field sobriety test on the side of the road in front of passing traffic. Had lectured him about responsibility and public safety with a smirk that suggested he enjoyed the power more than the duty. Jack wondered if Deputy Wade knew his father had been a thief. Probably. Probably didn't care. The last name that mattered was Frank Dalton. Jack had almost skipped over it, assuming it would be just another entry in a long list of betrayals. But Frank's record was different. $15,000, 1982 office expansion, business loan, 5% interest, 5-year term. The repayment schedule showed Frank had paid on time, every time for 5 years. The final entry in 1987 said, paid in full, 6 months early, only man in 10 years to honor terms without being reminded. If more men were like Frank Dalton, I would not need this house. Jack felt something loosen in his chest. Frank had paid, had kept his word. That's why Sam had trusted him as executor. That's why Frank had been the only person allowed to visit the Earthbag house in the final years. Frank had earned it. By mid-afternoon, Jack had compiled a list. 7 names, 7 debts. Clayton Burgess, $85,000 plus 35 years interest equals approximately $340,000. Richard Voss, $12,000 plus 26 years interest equals $31,000. Dr. Helen Strauss, $27,000 remaining balance plus 29 years interest equals $78,000. Mayor Andrew Kern, $45,000 plus 21 years interest equals $97,000. Deputy Wade Holland, inherited from father, $22,000 plus 29 years interest equals $61,000. 2 others, small amounts, combined total $43,000. Grand total, $650,000. Jack stared at the number. $650,000. Enough to pay off his farm debt and have money left over. Enough to rebuild. Enough to start again. So all he had to do was collect what his grandfather was owed. What Jack was now owed. The law was on his side. The ledgers were meticulous. Witnesses had signed most of the contracts. Some were dead, but the signatures were there, notarized in some cases. Any court would rule in his favor. He could take every one of them to court and win, but Sam's letter echoed in his head. If you choose noise, it will answer you in kind. Jack left the Earthbag house just before sunset, locking the door behind him and hiding the key under the stone, the way Sam had done for 50 years. He drove back to town with the ledgers in a box on the passenger seat. The weight of them felt heavier than paper should. At a stoplight on Main Street, he glanced to his left and saw Clayton Burgess's truck parked outside Miller's Diner. Big, black, spotless. $70,000 of chrome and leather, paid for with money that should have been Sam's. Jack felt his hands tighten on the steering wheel. The light turned green. He drove on. That night, Jack sat in his cold farmhouse kitchen with a yellow legal pad and started making calls. Not to the people who owed him money. Not yet. First, he needed to understand what he was dealing with. He called Frank Dalton at home. Frank answered on the third ring, his voice rough with age and the remnants of dinner. Jack didn't waste time on pleasantries. I found the ledgers, he said. I found the safe. I know what Sam was doing. There was a long pause on the other end. Then Frank said quietly, I thought you might. That house has a way of revealing things when people are ready to see them. Clayton Burgess owes me $340,000, Jack said. Voss owes $31,000. There are 5 others. Sam documented everything, every loan, every broken promise, every refusal to pay. I could take them all to court and win. Why didn't he? Frank was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that Jack recognized. The weight of a man who'd spent years thinking about a question that didn't have a good answer. Because Sam understood something most men don't learn until it's too late, Frank said. Winning and surviving are different things. You can win a court case and lose everything that matters. You can collect every dollar owed to you and still die alone in a house made of dirt because nobody wants to be around a man who can't let go of being right. Jack felt something cold settle in his stomach. You paid him back, he said. I did, Frank confirmed. And you want to know why? Not because I'm more honest than Clayton Burgess. Not because I'm a better man than Richard Voss. I paid Sam back because my father taught me that a man's word is the only thing he owns that can't be taken from him. And because Sam helped me when he didn't have to, and that meant something. But Jack, here's the truth. Most men aren't like that. Most men take help when they need it and forget about it when they don't. That's not evil. That's just human. So what am I supposed to do, Jack asked. Just let them get away with it? Let Clayton keep his land and his money while I lose everything? Frank sighed. I'm not telling you what to do. I'm telling you what Sam chose. He chose patience. He chose documentation. He chose to wait and see if any of them would do the right thing without being forced. Some did, most didn't. And in the end, he left the choice to you. Because Sam knew something else. The man who collects these debts won't be the same man who walks away from them. You need to decide which man you want to be. Jack thanked Frank and hung up. He sat in the dark kitchen for a long time, staring at the legal pad where he'd written the 7 names, $340,000. That number alone would save the farm, would let him sleep at night without listening for the phone to ring with another threat from the bank, would let him stop feeling like a failure every time he looked at his son's photograph. The question was simple. Did he want justice or peace? And if he was honest with himself, he knew the answer before he even asked the question. He wanted revenge. He wanted to walk into Clayton Burgess's mansion and throw the ledger on his expensive table and watch him squirm. Wanted to see Richard Voss's face when he realized the man he'd dismissed and threatened was about to ruin him. Wanted to make them all pay, not just in money, but in humiliation and fear and the sudden understanding that their success had been built on theft. But wanting something and doing it were separated by the same thin line his grandfather had warned him about. Jack went to bed that night without deciding anything. But he dreamed. Not about Okinawa this time, about his son. Matt was 10 years old in the dream, standing in a wheat field that stretched to the horizon. The wheat was golden and ripe, and the sun was the kind of perfect that only exists in memory or imagination. Matt looked at Jack and smiled, the gap-toothed smile he'd had before his permanent teeth came in. You coming, Dad? Matt asked. We got work to do. Jack wanted to walk to him, wanted to cross that field and pull his son into his arms and tell him everything he should have said when Matt was alive. But his feet wouldn't move. He was stuck at the edge of the field, watching Matt get farther away even though the boy wasn't moving. I can't, Jack said. I'm stuck. I don't know how to get to you. Matt tilted his head, the way he used to when he was thinking hard about something. You're not stuck, Dad. You're just carrying too much. Put it down. Then you can move. Jack woke with tears on his face and the certainty that his subconscious was smarter than his waking mind. He was carrying too much. Rage, grief, the weight of proving he deserved the help his grandfather had left him. The need to make everyone who'd wronged Sam pay for it. But none of that would bring Matt back. None of that would make Karen proud. None of that would turn the farm into something other than a monument to loss. By the time the sun rose, Jack had made a decision. Not the decision he wanted to make, but the one he could live with. He would confront Clayton. Just Clayton. The man who owed the most. The man who'd been his friend. The man whose betrayal cut deepest not because of money, but because of what it represented. If Clayton paid, Jack would let the others go. If Clayton refused, then Jack would know that the quiet way was impossible. That sometimes you had to fight loud because quiet wasn't enough. He drove to Clayton's property just after 8 in the morning. The Burgess farm was everything Jack's wasn't. 600 acres of prime bottomland, irrigated and planted with precision. New equipment lined up in sheds with actual walls and roofs. A house that looked like it belonged in a suburb, not on a farm. White siding, black shutters, a 3-car garage with doors that probably opened with a button instead of a rope and a prayer. Jack parked his truck next to Clayton's. The contrast between the two vehicles, a perfect summary of how far their lives had diverged. He walked to the front door and knocked. Hard. 3 times. Waited. The door opened, and Clayton Burgess stood there in jeans and a shirt that probably cost more than Jack's grocery budget for a month. He was bigger than Jack remembered. 58 years old, but still solid. The kind of man who lifted weights in his home gym and paid someone to mow his lawn. His face was tanned and lined. Successful farmer lines, not struggling farmer lines. When he recognized Jack, his expression shifted. Surprise, then something guarded, then a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Jack Mercer, Clayton said, his voice carrying the forced warmth of a man who knew he should feel guilty, but had convinced himself he didn't. Been a while, brother. What brings you out here? Jack held up the ledger. He didn't say anything, just held it up so Clayton could see the worn leather cover, the gold numbers on the spine. 1980, Clayton's smile faded. He stared at the ledger for a long moment, and Jack watched the calculations happen behind his eyes. The realization, the assessment of threat, the decision about how to play this. You better come in, Clayton said finally. He stepped back, holding the door open. Jack walked into a house that smelled like expensive coffee and new carpet. The living room was huge, vaulted ceilings, leather furniture, a television the size of a window. Photos on the walls showed Clayton's family. 3 daughters, all grown now. A wife who looked tired in the eyes but smiled in every picture. Evidence of a life lived well on money that wasn't entirely his. Clayton led Jack to a dining room table made of wood so dark it was almost black. They sat across from each other, and Jack opened the ledger to the marked page. He slid it across the table so Clayton could read. Clayton looked at it for a long time. His jaw worked like he was chewing something tough. Then he looked up at Jack and his expression had changed again. No more warmth, no more pretense of friendship, just cold assessment. That was 35 years ago, Clayton said. His voice was flat, controlled. Your grandfather never asked me to pay it back. He asked, Jack said quietly. You refused. It's all documented. Every phone call, every letter, every excuse. He tracked it all, Clayton, for 35 years. So what? Clayton leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. Statute of limitations on debt collection is 6 years in Nebraska. You got nothing here, Jack. This is ancient history. Jack had expected this, had known Clayton wouldn't just fold. He pulled out the contract from the back of the ledger. The original loan document, signed by Clayton and witnessed by Clayton's father. The collateral description was explicit. 180 acres, Section 14, Township 9, to be transferred to Samuel Mercer in event of default. Default defined as failure to repay within agreed terms. Secured debt with real proper collateral doesn't have the same statute of limitations, Jack said. Frank Dalton confirmed it. This contract is enforceable. You signed it. Your father witnessed it. Sam never released the lien. The land is still collateral, Clayton, and you're in default. 35 years in default. Clayton's face went red. His hands flattened on the table, and for a moment Jack thought he might lunge across it. But he didn't. He just sat there, breathing hard, his whole body tense with anger or fear or both. Your grandfather never came after me, Clayton said through clenched teeth. Never took me to court. Never filed a claim. You know why? Because he knew he'd lose. Because that contract wouldn't hold up. Because the whole thing was a handshake deal dressed up to look legal. Jack shook his head. My grandfather didn't come after you because he was patient. Because he understood that taking what you're owed and destroying a man are different things. Because he believed in giving people the chance to do the right thing without being forced. But I'm not my grandfather, Clayton, and I'm out of patience. Clayton stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. Get out of my house, he said. His voice was shaking now. You come in here trying to shake me down with some old paper, trying to threaten me because you're broke and desperate. I'm not falling for it, Jack. You want to sue me? Go ahead. I've got lawyers, good ones, and I've got friends on the county board and the town council. You've got nothing but debt and a drinking problem everybody knows about. See who they believe. Jack stood too. He was shorter than Clayton by 3 inches, lighter by 40 pounds. But he'd survived things Clayton couldn't imagine. Had buried things that would break a man who'd never had to. And right now, standing in this house built on betrayal, he felt something in himself go very still and very cold. The kind of cold that came from knowing exactly how much you were capable of and choosing not to do it. My grandfather saved your life, Jack said quietly. After your father died and the bank was ready to foreclose, Sam gave you $85,000. That was his money, Clayton. Money he'd earned. Money he'd saved. And he gave it to you because your father had saved his life in Korea. He did it because he believed in honoring debts. The kind of debts that don't show up on paper but matter more than any contract. You took that money. You built all of this with it. And then you decided you didn't owe him anything. You decided his help didn't count because he didn't force you to pay. That makes you a thief, Clayton. A legal thief, maybe, but still a thief. Clayton's face was purple now. He pointed at the door. Get the fuck out of my house, now, or I'm calling Wade Holland and having you arrested for harassment. Jack picked up the ledger. He walked to the door, Clayton following him close enough that Jack could hear his breathing. At the threshold, Jack stopped and turned back. I'm giving you 30 days, he said. Pay what you owe or I file a lien claim in county court. And then everyone in town will know where your success came from. Everyone will know what kind of man you are. Clayton slammed the door so hard the frame shook. Jack walked back to his truck, his hands trembling with adrenaline and rage and the effort of not doing what every instinct told him to do, which was to go back inside and beat Clayton bloody. He drove away instead, got half a mile down the road before he had to pull over because his hands were shaking too hard to hold the wheel steady. He sat there on the shoulder, breathing hard, staring at his reflection in the rearview mirror. The man looking back at him was hollow-eyed and angry and looked exactly like his father had looked in the months before he died in Vietnam. Jack closed his eyes, tried to breathe slower, tried to remember what Sam's letter had said. Loud men die first. Silence is armor. By the time Jack got back to town, word had already spread. That was the thing about small towns. News traveled faster than truth. Jack stopped at the hardware store to buy fence staples and found the owner suddenly busy with inventory in the back. Stopped at the feed store and was told they could only take cash, no credit, effective immediately. His account had been suspended. Stopped at the diner for lunch and sat at the counter for 15 minutes before the waitress finally came over, her expression somewhere between pity and disgust. Jack ordered coffee. She brought it and walked away without offering him a menu. He drank the coffee in silence, listening to the conversations around him. Whispers, not even trying to hide it. That's Jack Mercer. Heard he tried to shake down Clayton Burgess. Got some old papers, trying to extort money. Desperate, that one. Lost his wife, lost his son, losing his farm. Can't accept it. Needs someone to blame. Clayton helped him once, you know. Gave him money when his wife was sick. Jack never paid it back. Now he's got the nerve to ask for more. Jack set down his cup very carefully, paid his bill in exact change, walked out. At his truck, Deputy Wade Holland was waiting, leaning against the driver's side door, arms crossed, mirror sunglasses reflecting Jack's approach. The deputy was 45, built like a man who spent too much time at the gym and not enough time doing real work. His uniform was crisp, his gun belt creaked with new leather. He smiled as Jack approached, the kind of smile a cat gives a mouse. "Mr. Mercer," Wade said. His voice was smooth, almost friendly. "Got a complaint about you, harassment, threatening behavior, some concerns about your mental state." Jack stopped 3 feet away. "I haven't harassed anyone. I went to speak with Clayton Burgess about a private financial matter." "That's not a crime." Wade's smile widened. "Funny thing, Mr. Burgess says you threatened him. Said you came to his house uninvited, made accusations, refused to leave when asked. That sounds like trespassing to me. Might be stalking, might be a few other things if I look hard enough." Jack felt his heart rate kick up, but his voice stayed level. His grandfather's voice. "I was invited in. I left when asked. No laws broken." Wade pushed off the truck, stepping closer. "Invading space in that way cops do when they want you to react. Jack, here's the thing. You're not in a good place right now. Everyone knows it. Farm's going under. You're drinking again. Don't deny it. I can smell it on you from here." Old wound, Jack thought. Wade Sr. had owed Sam money too, $22,000, never repaid. And now his son was using a badge to protect the family's reputation. "Like father, like son," the deputy continued, his voice dropping lower. "You keep bothering upstanding citizens with crazy stories about debts from before you were born. I'm going to have to take action. Could be a psych evaluation. Could be an arrest. Could be I find something in your truck right now that gives me cause to bring you in. Your choice." Jack looked past Wade to his truck, saw the way the deputy's hand rested near his belt, near the gun, near the taser, near all the tools of authority that could be used or misused depending on who was watching. There were no cameras here. No witnesses who'd side with Jack over a deputy. Frank Dalton's words came back to him. "You can win and still lose everything that matters." Jack stepped around Wade without another word, got in his truck, started the engine. Wade knocked on the window. Jack rolled it down. "Stay away from Clayton Burgess," Wade said. "Stay away from anyone on my list. You got problems, take them to a lawyer. You come after my family's friends again, I will end you. Understand?" Jack drove away without answering. In his rearview mirror, he watched Wade stand in the parking lot, phone already out, probably calling Clayton, probably coordinating, probably making sure Jack Mercer understood that he was outnumbered and outgunned and alone. That night, Jack sat in the Earthbag house with every light off except one lantern. He'd brought his sleeping bag, had decided that the farmhouse was too exposed, too easy for someone to visit him in the night and make it look like an accident. Out here, no one knew where he was. Out here, the walls were thick and the door had 3 deadbolts and the silence was complete. He opened the third safe, the one Sam's letter had mentioned but hadn't described. It was hidden better than the first 2, under a floorboard that looked like all the others unless you knew which one to press. Jack found it by feel, by intuition, by something that might have been luck or might have been his grandfather's ghost guiding his hand. Inside the safe were files, not ledgers, not contracts, just manila folders, each one labeled with a name. Jack pulled out Clayton Burgess's file first. Inside were photographs, old photographs, color but faded. They showed Clayton with a woman who wasn't his wife. The photos were dated 1997, 2 years after Clayton married. The woman in the photos looked young, too young. The second document in the file was an affidavit, signed and notarized, from a woman named Sarah Mitchell. It detailed a relationship with Clayton Burgess when she was 17 and he was 34. It described manipulation, promises, money given to keep her quiet. It described statutory rape in language that was clear and legal and damning. The third document was financial. Bank records showing systematic embezzlement from Burgess Family Farms, Inc. between 94 and 1998. Small amounts, 20,000 here, 30,000 there. Taken from the business Clayton's father had built, funneled into Clayton's personal accounts. His father had died never knowing his son was stealing from him. Sam had documented it all, had collected evidence, had kept it for 27 years without using it. Jack sat back, staring at the file. His grandfather had possessed the power to destroy Clayton Burgess at any time, could have sent him to prison, could have ruined his marriage, could have stripped away everything Clayton had built. But he hadn't. Wicked Jack pulled out Richard Voss's file. It was thinner. Just 3 DUI arrests between 2002 and 2008. All of them disappeared from public record. All of them covered up by Sheriff Wade Hollins Sr. Copies of police reports that showed Voss's blood alcohol levels, copies of evidence that had been suppressed, copies of payments made to ensure silence. Strauss's file contained evidence of insurance fraud, small scale but consistent. Mayor Kern's file documented election fraud, ballot stuffing, kickback schemes involving county contracts. Deputy Wade Hollins' file was the thickest. Drug use, evidence planting, excessive force incidents covered up, a pattern of corruption that went back 20 years. Sam had collected insurance on everyone who owed him money, not because he intended to use it, because he understood that power unused was more powerful than power deployed. Blackmail only worked if you never had to use it. The moment you did, the leverage was gone. Jack spent hours going through the files. By midnight, he understood something that made his chest ache. His grandfather hadn't been a lender. He'd been a guardian. He'd helped people because he believed in second chances. But he'd also prepared for the worst in human nature. Had documented their failings not to destroy them, but to protect himself, to ensure that if they ever came after him, he could defend himself without firing a shot. It was brilliant. It was paranoid. It was the work of a man who'd learned in war that survival required preparation and silence required strength. Jack closed the files and put them back in the safe. He lay down on Sam's cot, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind outside. He had 3 choices. Use the files, destroy Clayton and the others, collect every dollar owed, take the quiet path Sam had walked. Document, wait, survive, do nothing. Walk away, let the bank take the farm, start over somewhere else with nothing. He fell asleep without deciding, but his dreams made the choice for him. He dreamed of his son again. Matt was older this time, the age he'd been when he deployed, 22, strong, certain, ready to do his duty even though it would kill him. In the dream, Matt sat across from Jack at the Earthbag house table. The lantern burned between them. Your grandfather built this place to survive, Matt said. His voice was exactly as Jack remembered. Deep, calm, his mother's voice underneath his own. But surviving isn't the same as living, Dad. You taught me that. Jack wanted to respond, but couldn't find the words. Matt continued, looking at him with eyes that held no judgment. Just love, just truth. You can destroy them. You have the power. But if you do, you'll spend the rest of your life in this house, alone, just like Grandpa Sam. Is that what you want? To survive or to live? Jack woke just before dawn with the answer clear in his mind. He would fight, but he would fight quiet, the way Sam had taught him, the way survival demanded. He would use the debt, but not the files. He would take what was owed, but not everything. He would give them a choice, the same choice Sam had given him. And whatever they chose would tell him everything he needed to know about whether the quiet way could work in a world that had gotten so much louder since Sam built his fortress of earth and time and patience. Jack woke to the sound of his phone ringing in the pre-dawn darkness. The screen showed Frank Dalton's name, and when Jack answered, Frank's voice was tight with something that might have been concern or might have been warning. You need to see the paper, Frank said. Front page, they're calling you a predator. Jack drove into town as the sun was rising, stopped at the gas station, and bought a copy of the Kearney Herald. The headline was above the fold, impossible to miss. Local man threatens farmers with decades-old debt claims. The article was worse than the headline. It quoted Clayton Burgess extensively, painting Jack as a disturbed veteran using his grandfather's powers to extort money from successful community members. It mentioned Jack's drinking, his financial troubles, the foreclosure looming over his farm. It suggested, without quite saying it directly, that Jack was mentally unstable and possibly dangerous. The article quoted Mayor Andrew Kearns saying the town was monitoring the situation and considering a restraining order to protect citizens from harassment. It quoted Dr. Helen Strauss expressing concern about Jack's mental health and offering free counseling services if he would accept help. It did not mention that every person quoted owed Jack's grandfather money they had never repaid. It did not mention the contracts or the collateral or the decades of documentation Sam had kept. It presented only one side of the story, and that side made Jack look like exactly what Clayton had called him, a desperate man lashing out at people who tried to help him. Jack sat in his truck in the gas station parking lot and read the article 3 times. Each reading made the trap more obvious. Clayton had moved first, had controlled the narrative, had turned the whole town against Jack before Jack could even begin to make his case. This was why Sam had stayed silent, because the moment you spoke, the moment you made your claims public, you gave your enemies a target, and men like Clayton Burgess were very good at hitting targets. Jack drove back to the Earthbag house and spent the morning thinking. The quiet pressed in from all sides, but instead of being oppressive, it felt clarifying. Like the silence was stripping away everything except what mattered. By noon, he'd made his decision. He would not fight this battle in the court of public opinion. He would not try to defend himself to people who'd already decided what to believe. He would go directly to the source, one by one. Quietly, he would offer each person who owed Sam money the same choice. Pay what you owe, or I file a legal claim and let the courts decide. No blackmail, no threats, no public accusations. Just the facts and the law, and the decision each person would make when confronted with both. The first person Jack visited was Margaret Chen. Her grocery store sat on Main Street between the hardware store and the post office, a building that had been there longer than Jack had been alive. The interior smelled like produce and floor wax and the particular mustiness of a place that had seen 3 generations pass through its doors. Margaret was behind the counter, ringing up an elderly woman's purchases. She was 67, small and wiry, her hair cut short and practical. When she saw Jack, her expression didn't change. She finished with her customer, waited until the woman left, then turned to Jack with eyes that had seen enough of life to know when a man was carrying weight. "I wondered when you'd come," she said. Her voice was accented, the remnants of Mandarin shaping her English in ways that softened the consonants. "Sit, we'll talk." She led Jack to a small office in the back, barely bigger than a closet, with a desk covered in invoices and a calendar from 2018 still hanging on the wall. They sat across from each other, and Margaret folded her hands on the desk with the patience of someone who'd learned long ago that rushing never helped. "Your grandfather was a good man," she said before Jack could speak. "When my husband died, I had 3 children in a store I didn't know how to run. The bank said no. Everyone said sell, start over somewhere else. Sam said yes. He gave me $8,000. Told me to take my time paying it back. Told me my children needed their mother more than he needed his money." Jack nodded. "I found the ledger," he said. "It shows you repaid him in full. 2 years. Every dollar plus interest." Margaret smiled, but it was a sad smile. "I repaid him, yes. But what the ledger doesn't show is that he gave it back. Anonymous donation to the church building fund, designated for my family. My daughter's college tuition appeared like magic. I didn't know it was Sam until Father Quinn told me years later, after Sam's funeral. By then it was too late to thank him." She reached into her desk and pulled out an envelope. Inside was a check made out to Jack Mercer for $15,000. Jack stared at it, not understanding. "Sam lent me $8,000, Margaret said. "I'm giving you 15. That's what I would owe him with interest if he hadn't given it back. I know you're in trouble, Jack. Everyone knows. I know Clayton and the others are trying to destroy you. This won't fix everything, but it's what I owe. What I should have paid before Sam died." Jack's throat tightened. "You don't owe me anything. The ledger says it was settled." "The ledger says what Sam wanted it to say," Margaret replied. "But I know what happened. I know the kind of man he was, and I know the kind of man you're trying to be. Take the check, Jack, use it, and when you have the chance, do for someone else what Sam did for me. That's how the debt gets repaid." Jack took the check. His hands were shaking, and he had to clear his throat twice before he could speak. "Thank you," he managed. Margaret stood, indicating the conversation was over. She had a store to run, but at the door she stopped him with a hand on his arm. The others won't be like me, she said quietly. Clayton, Richard, the ones who got rich and forgot where they came from. They'll fight you. They'll use every weapon they have. You need to be ready for that, Jack. Your grandfather survived by being quieter than his enemies. You need to be quieter still. The second person Jack visited didn't go as well. Dr. Helen Strauss's office was in a medical building on the edge of town, all glass and steel, and the kind of aggressive modernity that didn't belong in rural Nebraska. The receptionist tried to turn Jack away, saying Dr. Strauss was with patients and couldn't be disturbed. Jack said he'd wait. He sat in the lobby for 2 hours watching people come and go, watching the receptionist make increasingly nervous phone calls to someone in the back. Finally, at 4:15, Dr. Strauss emerged. She was 64, tall and angular, wearing a white coat over clothes that probably cost more than Jack's truck payment. Her expression when she saw Jack was cold enough to frost glass. "Mr. Mercer," she said, her voice clipped and professional. "I don't have time for whatever this is. You need to leave." Jack stood, holding the ledger. "I just need 5 minutes. It's about my grandfather and a loan he made to you in 1987. Dr. Strauss's jaw tightened. "I have no idea what you're talking about. Now leave, or I'll call security." $38,000, Jack said, his voice level. "To start your practice. You repaid $11,000 and stopped. The remaining $27,000, with interest, is now worth $78,000. The contract had collateral provisions. I'm here to discuss repayment terms before I file a legal claim." Dr. Strauss stared at him for a long moment. Then she did something Jack didn't expect. She laughed. It was a short, sharp sound like ice breaking. "You're serious," she said. "You actually think you can come into my office and threaten me with some alleged debt from 40 years ago? Let me explain something to you, Mr. Mercer. Your grandfather was a paranoid recluse who died alone in a dirt hovel. Whatever papers he kept, whatever fantasy world he lived in, has no bearing on reality. If you pursue this, I will bury you in legal fees. I will have you declared mentally incompetent. I will make sure everyone in this county knows you're harassing a physician who serves this community. Do you understand me?" Jack understood perfectly. He understood that Dr. Strauss had convinced herself that Sam's help didn't count because it came from someone she considered beneath her. He understood that she'd built her success on borrowed money and borrowed time and had never lost a moment of sleep over either. He understood that she would fight with everything she had because admitting the debt meant admitting she wasn't self-made, and that was something her pride couldn't survive. "I'll see you in court," Jack said quietly. He turned and walked out before she could respond. The confrontations continued over the next week. Some went better than others. A farmer named Robert Haskins, who owed $18,000 from a loan in 2002, met Jack at a coffee shop and broke down crying. He'd thought the debt was forgiven when Sam died. He had $4,000 in savings, offered it all, begged for time to come up with the rest. Jack told him to keep his savings and work out a payment plan with Frank Dalton. $500 a month, no interest. Haskins shook Jack's hand so hard it hurt, and when he left, there were still tears in his eyes. But most interactions were hostile. Richard Voss refused to meet with Jack at all, sent a letter through a lawyer threatening a lawsuit for harassment and defamation. Mayor Andrew Kern had Jack escorted from his office by security after Jack produced a ledger showing $45,000 in unpaid loans. The mayor called Jack a con artist and said he'd have the sheriff investigate Jack for fraud. By the end of the week, Jack had collected promises of repayment from 3 people, totaling $34,000. He'd been threatened with lawsuits by 4 others, and he'd been banned from entering 2 businesses in town. The walls were closing in, but so was something else. A pattern was emerging that Jack hadn't anticipated. The people who'd succeeded without ever acknowledging Sam's help were the ones fighting hardest. The people who'd struggled, who remembered what desperation felt like, were the ones trying to make things right. It was a dividing line that cut through the community like a fault line, separating those who understood debt from those who'd convinced themselves they'd earned everything alone. On the 8th day, everything changed. Jack woke in the Earthbag house to the sound of his phone ringing. It was 4:30 in the morning. No one called at 4:30 unless something was catastrophically wrong. He answered to find Frank Dalton's voice, rough with sleep and anger, and something that sounded like fear. "Jack, your farmhouse is on fire. Fire department's there now, but it's bad. You need to get there." Jack dressed in 30 seconds and drove through the darkness with his headlights cutting tunnels through the black. He could see the glow before he could see the flames, an orange shimmer against the night sky that looked wrong in the way all destruction looks wrong. When he pulled up to his property, 3 fire trucks were already there, hoses spraying water that seemed to evaporate before it touched the flames. The house where he'd lived with Karen, where Matt had grown up, where 4 generations of Mercers had been born and died, was burning like it wanted to erase itself from existence. The roof had already collapsed. The walls were going. By dawn, there would be nothing left but a foundation and ash. Jack stood in his driveway and watched it burn. He felt hollow, numb, like the fire was consuming something inside him that he hadn't known was still there. Frank appeared beside him, his face lit orange by the flames. "The fire chief says it started in 2 places," Frank said quietly. "Kitchen and bedroom, simultaneous ignition. That doesn't happen by accident, Jack." Jack knew it didn't, knew exactly who was responsible and why, knew that this was the answer to his confrontations, the response to his demands for repayment. "If you fight us, we'll destroy you. Not just financially, completely." The fire burned until sunrise. When it was finally out, the house was gone. Just a smoking ruin that would take a bulldozer to clear. The barn had caught too, despite the firefighters' efforts. The old wood had gone up fast. Jack's tractor was a melted hunk of metal and rubber. His tools were slag. 12 heifers had been in the barn. They'd burned alive, and Jack could still hear their screaming in his head, a sound that would follow him for the rest of his life. The fire chief was a man named Tom Rivera, 50-something, professional, sympathetic. He walked through the wreckage with a clipboard, taking notes, shaking his head. "Any idea what might have caused this?" Rivera asked. Jack looked at him steadily. "Arson." Rivera's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. "You got evidence of that? Security cameras? Witnesses?" Jack shook his head. "Just common sense. My electrical was old but functional. I don't smoke. I wasn't home. And it started in 2 places at once. That's not an electrical fire, Chief. That's someone with gasoline and matches." Rivera wrote something on his clipboard. "I'll note your concerns in my report. Insurance company will investigate. But without evidence, it'll probably be ruled accidental. Faulty wiring. These old farmhouses, they go up fast." Jack understood what he was really saying. That without proof, without witnesses, without someone willing to testify, it would be easier and cleaner for everyone to call it an accident. No investigation, no arrests, no questions about who might have wanted Jack Mercer's house to burn. Frank drove Jack back to the Earthbag house. Neither of them spoke until they were inside, door locked, sitting at Sam's table with the dawn light starting to filter through the narrow windows. "They're trying to break you," Frank said. "They're showing you what happens when you don't back down." Jack nodded. He felt tired in a way that sleep wouldn't fix. "They succeeded," he said. "The house is gone, the barn's gone, my equipment's gone, half my cattle are dead. Even if I wanted to keep farming, I can't. There's nothing left to farm with." Frank pulled out a folder from his briefcase. Inside were papers Jack recognized, the loan documents from First National Bank. But there was something else too, a letter dated 3 days ago. "The bank's accelerating your loan," Frank said, "calling it due in full immediately. 30 days to pay or they foreclose. They're citing the fire as diminished collateral value. It's legal, barely, but it's also coordinated. Someone at the bank is working with Clayton and the others. They're making sure you can't recover." Jack looked at the letter without really seeing it. He'd known this was coming, had felt it in the way Deputy Wade had smiled at him, in the way Dr. Strauss had laughed, in the way the newspaper article had been written. This wasn't about money anymore. This was about making an example, about showing everyone in town what happened when you challenged the powerful, about ensuring no one else would ever dig up old debts or question old deals. Frank leaned forward, his voice low and urgent. "Jack, you've got one option left. The insurance files. Use them. Release the information Sam collected. Destroy Clayton and the others before they destroy you completely. It's self-defense at this point." Jack thought about the files locked in the 3rd safe, about the photographs of Clayton with that girl, about Richard Voss's DUIs and Dr. Strauss's insurance fraud, and all the evidence Sam had collected over decades. One phone call to the right newspaper, one anonymous package to the state attorney general, and they'd all go down. Their reputations destroyed, their crimes exposed, their power stripped away. He could do it. Part of him wanted to. The part that had watched his house burn, that had heard his cattle die, that was so tired of being quiet while the world got louder around him. But another part, the part that sounded like Matt's voice in his dreams, asked a different question. What happens after? If Jack released those files, if he destroyed his enemies, what would he become? Not his grandfather. Sam had held that information for 50 years without using it, had chosen patience over revenge every single day. If Jack broke that discipline, if he went loud the way everyone expected him to, then Sam's life meant nothing. The Earthbag house meant nothing. The inheritance was wasted. Jack stood and walked to the small window. Outside, the prairie stretched empty and endless under a sky that was turning the pale gray of an old man's hair. He thought about survival, about what his grandfather had survived and how, about the choice that had been building since the moment he opened that first safe. When he turned back to Frank, his decision was made. "I'm not using the files," Jack said. His voice was steady, final. "That's not the fight I'm having." Frank stared at him. "Jack, they burned your house down. They're taking your land. They're trying to destroy you. You have to fight back." "I am fighting back," Jack said, "just not their way." He pulled out the ledgers and spread them on the table. "I'm filing legal claims against everyone who owes money and refuses to pay. Secure debt with collateral. Let the courts decide. It'll take time, but it's clean, legal, the right way." Frank rubbed his face with both hands. "That could take years, cost tens of thousands in legal fees. You don't have that kind of time or money." "Margaret Chen gave me $15,000, Jack said. "Robert Haskins is paying $500 a month. There are two others making payments. That's a start. I'll sell Sam's land parcels if I have to. Use that money for legal fees. I'll move into this house permanently. Live on nothing, work whatever jobs I can find. I'll survive the way my grandfather survived. One day at a time, one choice at a time." "You're willing to lose everything for this?" Frank asked. Jack shook his head. "I've already lost everything that mattered. My wife, my son, my home. What's left is just stuff and dirt and pride. But what I won't lose is myself. I won't become them. I won't win by being louder and meaner and more ruthless. Because if I do that, then they've already won." Frank was quiet for a long time. Then he nodded slowly. "All right, I'll start the paperwork. But Jack, you need to understand, they're not going to stop. Burning your house was just the beginning. They'll come after you harder now. Make your life impossible. You're going to need help." Jack thought about that, about allies, about who in this town might stand with him against men like Clayton Burgess. The list was short, but it wasn't empty. "Then help me find it," Jack said. The help came from an unexpected place. 2 days after the fire, Father Thomas Quinn appeared at the Earthbag house. Jack had been splitting firewood, preparing for winter, trying to keep his hands busy so his mind wouldn't spiral into the dark places it wanted to go. Quinn was 71, silver-haired, wearing his priest's collar and a jacket that had seen better decades. He walked with a slight limp, a souvenir from Vietnam that he never talked about, but everyone knew was there. "Father," Jack said, setting down the axe, "wasn't expecting you." Quinn looked around at the Earthbag house, at the rough walls and the narrow windows, at the structure that had been a joke to everyone except the man who'd built it. "I've been here before," Quinn said. "Many times. Your grandfather and I were friends. Not close friends, perhaps, but friends in the way men who've seen war can be friends. We understood each other." He sat on the bench Jack had built outside the door, and Jack sat beside him. They looked out at the empty land, at the horizon where the sky met the earth in a line so straight it looked drawn with a ruler. "I know what Clayton and the others are doing to you," Quinn said. "I know about the fire, about the newspaper article, about the threats, and I want you to know that I'm prepared to testify on your behalf if this goes to court, about the loans Sam made to the church, about his character, about the kind of man he was." Jack felt something loosen in his chest. "That could cost you, Father. Clayton's on the parish council. Dr. Strauss is a major donor. They could make things difficult for the church." Quinn smiled, and it was the smile of a man who'd faced worse things than social pressure. I'm 71 years old, Jack. I've been a priest for 47 years. I've buried more people than I've baptized. And I've learned something in all that time. The church isn't the building or the donors or the parish council. The church is the people who show up when someone's in trouble and ask how they can help. If standing with you cost me Clayton Burgess's approval, then I'm getting off cheap. There was a long silence. Then Jack asked the question he'd been holding since he'd read his grandfather's letter. Why did Sam live out here, Father? Why did he build this house and hide from everyone for 50 years? Quinn took a long breath like he was deciding how much to say. Your grandfather killed a man on Okinawa, he began. A boy, really. Japanese soldier, maybe 16 years old, dying already from American artillery. The boy asked Sam for water. Sam gave it to him. Then the boy reached for a grenade. Sam shot him. Had to. It was survival. But after, Sam searched the body and found a photograph. The boy's family, wife and 3 children. Sam took that photograph, carried it for the rest of his life. He showed it to me once, years ago, after enough whiskey to loosen his tongue. He said that boy's face followed him everywhere. Said he'd killed a father, a husband, a son. And even though it was war, even though it was necessary, it never stopped being murder in his mind. Quinn turned to look at Jack directly. Sam built this house because he needed a place where that boy's ghost couldn't follow, where the war couldn't follow. He made it from Earth because Earth is patient, because Earth doesn't judge, because you can press your hands against Earth and feel like you're touching something older than any war, any killing, any human mistake. He lived here for 50 years, not because he was crazy, Jack. He lived here because it was the only place he could breathe. Jack felt tears on his face and didn't wipe them away. He thought about his own ghosts, about Matt's voice in his dreams, about Karen's face in the moments before the cancer took her mind along with her body, about the weight of surviving people you love. I understand, Jack said quietly. Quinn nodded. I know you do. That's why I'm here. That's why I'll stand with you. Because your grandfather survived his war by being silent and strong and immovable as Earth. And because you're trying to do the same thing. And because this town needs to see that the quiet way still works, even when the world screams at you to be loud. That night, Jack received a visitor he didn't expect. Margaret Chen's pickup truck pulled up to the Earthbag house just after dark. And when she got out, she wasn't alone. 5 other people climbed out with her. Jack recognized them all. Robert Haskins, the farmer who'd broken down crying. Linda Wu, who'd borrowed money for her son's medical treatment in 1995 and repaid it in full. 2 other families Sam had helped, people who'd lost their way in the farm crisis and found it again with his quiet support. And one more person who shocked Jack into silence. Deputy Wade Holland, not Wade Jr., the bully with the badge. Wade Jr.'s cousin, Thomas Wade, a mechanic who worked at the garage on Route 44. Thomas was 48, built like someone who lifted engine blocks for a living, with grease under his nails and the permanent squint of a man who worked in sun and fluorescent light. They gathered in the Earthbag house, crowding into the single room, standing because there weren't enough places to sit. Margaret spoke first, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd decided something and wouldn't be talked out of it. We've been meeting, she said, quietly. Those of us who knew what Sam did for this community. Those of us who remember what it's like to need help and have doors slam in your face. We know what Clayton and the others are doing to you. We know about the fire. We know about the threats. And we've decided we're not going to stand by and let it happen. Robert Haskins stepped forward, nervous but determined. Sam saved my farm in 2002. I would have lost everything if not for him. I never got to thank him before he died. But I can thank you by standing with you now. Thomas Wade spoke next, his voice rough. My father was Sheriff Wade Holland. I know what he did. I know he never paid back what he owed Sam. I've been ashamed of that my whole life. My cousin's a bully and a disgrace to the badge. I'm here to testify to that if you need me. One by one they spoke, each of them offering something. Testimony, financial help, labor, a place to stay if Jack needed it. Witness statements about Sam's character, about the loans, about the kind of man he'd been. Together they represented a counter-narrative to the one Clayton Burgess had built. Proof that Sam hadn't been a crazy recluse, but a pillar of the community that the community had forgotten to acknowledge. Jack didn't know what to say. His throat was too tight for words. So he just nodded over and over until Margaret smiled and patted his arm. "We're not letting them destroy you, Jack. Your grandfather helped us when no one else would. Now it's our turn. We might not be rich like Clayton, might not have power like the mayor, but we're here, and we're not going anywhere." After they left, Jack sat alone in the darkness of the Earthbag house. The walls pressed in around him, familiar now, comforting in the way only earned shelter can be. He thought about his grandfather sitting in this same spot 50 years ago, newly moved in, surrounded by walls he'd built with his own hands from dirt and time and determination. Sam must have felt alone, must have wondered if choosing this life, this isolation, this fortress of silence was the right decision. But he'd survived. And now, 7 decades after killing a boy on Okinawa, after carrying that weight through a lifetime of quiet penance, Sam's legacy was this: people who remembered his kindness, people willing to stand against power because someone had once stood for them. People who understood that the quiet way wasn't weakness. It was strength so deep it didn't need to announce itself. Jack lay down on the cot and closed his eyes. For the first time since the fire, he slept without dreaming. And when he woke the next morning to the pale light filtering through the narrow windows, he knew exactly what came next. The quiet fight would continue, not with rage or revenge or the loud satisfaction of destroying his enemies, but with patience and law and the slow grinding certainty that truth, given enough time, was louder than any lie. The storm was coming. Jack could feel it building, but he was ready, because his grandfather had built him a fortress. And fortresses, when properly built, don't fall. They just wait. The legal filings began on a Monday morning in late November, when the first frost had turned the prairie grass silver and the sky looked like hammered tin. Frank Dalton walked into the county courthouse with a briefcase full of documents that represented 50 years of patient record keeping and one man's decision to fight the way his grandfather had taught him: quiet, methodical, unshakable. The claims were simple and devastating in their simplicity. Jack Mercer, as inheritor and trustee of the Samuel Mercer estate, was filing suit to collect secured debts with documented collateral. Each filing included the original loan contract, signed and witnessed. Each included a payment history showing exactly when payments stopped. Each included a collateral description tied to specific parcels of land. Each included a demand for repayment in full plus contractually agreed interest, or transfer of collateral as specified in the original agreements. Clayton Burgess, $340,000. Collateral, 180 acres, Section 14, Township 9. Richard Voss, $31,000. Collateral, personal property liens. Dr. Helen Strauss, $78,000. Collateral, medical practice, equipment, and real property. Mayor Andrew Kern, $97,000. Collateral, commercial property downtown. 3 others, smaller amounts but no less documented, no less legal, no less enforceable. By noon, the news had spread through town like a grass fire in August. By evening, Jack's phone was ringing every 15 minutes with calls he didn't answer. By the next morning, Clayton Burgess had hired the most expensive law firm in Lincoln, 100 miles away, known for defending corporations against class action suits and making problems disappear through aggressive litigation and procedural delays. The attorney's name was Marcus Weaver, 55, 3-piece suits and silver hair, and a reputation for scorched earth tactics. He filed motions to dismiss within 48 hours, arguing that the statute of limitations had expired, that the contracts were invalid due to improper notarization, that Sam Mercer had been mentally incompetent when he made the loans. Frank Dalton countered every motion with documentation that was airtight, notarization records from county files, medical records showing Sam had been evaluated as mentally sound for insurance purposes as recently as 2020. Legal precedent establishing that secured debt with real property collateral operated under different limitation rules than unsecured personal debt. The judge assigned to the case was Harold Brennan, 68 years old, a farmer's son who'd put himself through law school working construction and had been on the bench for 32 years. He had a reputation for patience and fairness and an absolute intolerance for legal theatrics. He scheduled a preliminary hearing for 3 weeks out and told both sides to come prepared with evidence, not arguments. Jack spent those 3 weeks living in the Earthbag house and working whatever jobs he could find. He hauled hay for a ranch 15 miles north, earning $12 an hour and a back that ached so badly some nights he couldn't straighten up. He repaired fences for a widow who couldn't afford to hire professionals, and she paid him in venison and potatoes and jars of preserves she'd canned last summer. He worked at Thomas Wade's garage, cleaning parts and organizing tools, learning that his hands remembered mechanical work even though his mind had tried to forget it. The money was barely enough to survive on, but survival was all he needed. The Earthbag house required almost nothing. No electricity bill, no gas bill. Heat came from a wood stove he'd found tucked behind Sam's shelves, a small cast iron unit that would warm the space if he fed it steadily. Water came from a hand pump connected to a well Sam had drilled in 1976. The mechanism was simple and functional, and after Jack cleaned the rust and replaced a gasket, it worked perfectly. Food was simple: rice and beans bought in bulk, coffee made strong enough to strip paint, bread when he could afford it, nothing when he couldn't. He lost 15 pounds in 3 weeks and felt stronger for it, like he was burning away everything soft and unnecessary until only the essential parts remained. At night, he read his grandfather's ledgers by lantern light, not looking for evidence anymore, but for understanding. Sam had been meticulous, not because he was obsessive, but because precision was a form of prayer. Every entry made with care, every number checked and rechecked, every contract filed in order. It was the discipline of a man who understood that chaos was always one moment of carelessness away, and that survival meant never giving chaos that moment. Jack began keeping his own ledger, not of debts, but of days. He recorded what he ate, what he earned, what he thought about as the nights grew longer and colder. He recorded the names of people who helped him. Margaret Chen, who left groceries on his doorstep twice a week. Father Quinn, who stopped by every Sunday after Mass to talk about nothing in particular and everything that mattered. Thomas Wade, who paid Jack more than the work was worth and pretended not to notice. He recorded the names of people who turned against him too, not out of anger, but out of the same commitment to documentation that had defined his grandfather's life. The hardware store owner who told him his business wasn't welcome anymore. The banker who'd smirked when Jack walked past his office. The woman at the post office who'd asked loudly if Jack was still harassing decent people with his crazy demands. He wrote it all down, not for revenge, but for memory, because forgetting was its own kind of death, and Jack had buried enough without burying the truth too. The preliminary hearing happened on a Wednesday morning in December. The courthouse was old, built in 1923, with wooden benches worn smooth by 3 generations of farmers and criminals, and people whose lives had intersected with the law in ways both chosen and inevitable. Jack sat at the plaintiff's table with Frank Dalton, wearing clothes he'd borrowed from Thomas Wade because his own had been destroyed in the fire. A dress shirt that was slightly too big, slacks that bunched at the ankles, shoes that pinched but looked respectable. He felt like a child playing dress-up, but Frank had insisted. Appearances mattered in court, even when truth was on your side. Across the aisle sat Clayton Burgess with Marcus Weaver and 2 associates whose jobs seemed to be carrying briefcases and looking intimidating. Clayton wore a suit that probably cost $3,000, tailored and pressed, and projecting the confidence of a man who'd never lost anything he couldn't replace. Behind him in the gallery sat Dr. Helen Strauss, Richard Voss, Mayor Kern, and a dozen others. A show of force. A message that Jack was alone and they were many. But Jack wasn't alone. Behind him sat Margaret Chen, Father Quinn, Robert Haskins, Linda Wu, Thomas Wade, and 15 others. People who'd known Sam Mercer. People who'd been helped by him. People who'd come to bear witness to the fact that the man everyone dismissed as crazy had been the sanest person in the room. Judge Brennan entered, and everyone stood. He was a big man, 6 feet tall and heavy through the shoulders, with white hair and eyes that looked like they'd seen every variation of human foolishness and found none of it surprising. He sat, gestured for everyone else to sit, and looked over his reading glasses at the papers in front of him. "Mr. Weaver," Judge Brennan said, his voice carrying the gravel of age and authority, "you filed motions to dismiss on multiple grounds. Let's start with statute of limitations. Explain why you believe these claims are time-barred." Marcus Weaver stood, buttoning his suit jacket, and launched into an argument that was technically sophisticated and emotionally hollow. He cited case law and statutory provisions and argued that loans made in the 1980s and 1990s could not be collected in 2024, regardless of whether they'd been secured by collateral. He suggested that Sam Mercer had engaged in predatory lending, that he'd taken advantage of desperate people, that the contracts themselves were unconscionable. It was a performance designed to confuse and overwhelm, to make the judge question whether enforcing these old agreements was worth the legal complexity. Judge Brennan listened without interrupting, taking notes in a leather-bound book that looked as old as the courthouse itself. When Weaver finished, the judge turned to Frank Dalton. "Mr. Dalton, you've been practicing law in this county since before I was on the bench. What's your response?" Frank stood, and when he spoke, his voice was quieter than Weaver's, but carried more weight. "Your Honor, the law is clear. Secured debt with real proper collateral is not subject to the same statute of limitations as unsecured personal debt. These loans were secured. The collateral is specifically described in each contract. The contracts were properly executed, properly notarized, and properly filed with the county recorder's office. Mr. Mercer's grandfather maintained perfect records of every transaction, every payment, every communication. The defendants stopped paying not because the debts were satisfied, but because they chose to. That choice doesn't erase the debt. It just defers the reckoning." Frank placed a document on the judge's bench. "This is the contract between Samuel Mercer and Clayton Burgess, dated March 17, 1989. It specifies that in the event of default, defined as failure to repay within the agreed terms, the collateral property transfers to the lender. Mr. Burgess has been in default for 35 years. The property specified in the contract is worth approximately $400,000 today. The amount owed with interest is $340,000. Mr. Mercer is not asking for more than what the contract allows. He's asking for exactly what was agreed upon." Judge Brennan picked up the contract and read it slowly, his expression unreadable. Then he looked up at Clayton. "Mr. Burgess, stand please." Clayton stood, his jaw tight. "Did you sign this contract?" the judge asked. "Yes," Clayton said, "under duress. My father had just died. The bank was foreclosing. I had no choice." Judge Brennan's eyes narrowed slightly. "Were you forced to sign at gunpoint?" "No, but it was financial coercion." "Then it wasn't duress in any legal sense," the judge said. "Did you receive the money that's specified in this contract?" "Yes, but that was different times. Things were understood differently." "What was understood differently?" the judge asked. "That you could take money and not pay it back?" The courtroom was silent. Clayton's face was red, but he had enough sense not to argue with a judge who clearly wasn't sympathetic. Judge Brennan set down the contract and looked at Marcus Weaver. "Your motion to dismiss on statute of limitations grounds is denied. These are secured debts with properly executed contracts. Mr. Dalton is correct that they're enforceable regardless of age." He picked up another document. "Your second motion argues that Samuel Mercer was mentally incompetent at the time these loans were made. You've provided no medical evidence to support that claim. Only speculation based on his lifestyle choices. Living in an unconventional house doesn't constitute mental incompetence, Mr. DeWeaver. If it did, half of Nebraska would be under conservatorship. That motion is denied as well." Weaver tried to interrupt. "Your Honor, if we could just present additional evidence that it was a low blow," and Judge Brennan cut him off with a raised hand. "We're not here for a full trial, counselor. This is a preliminary hearing to determine if the plaintiff has presented sufficient evidence to proceed." "He has. These contracts exist. They're valid. The collateral is identified. The defendants have not presented evidence that the debts were satisfied. Therefore, this case will proceed to trial." He looked at his calendar. "I'm setting a trial date for February 15th. Both sides will have 60 days to prepare. Discovery will be limited to documents directly related to these specific contracts. I don't want this turning into a fishing expedition about Mr. Mercer's entire lending history or the defendant's financial situations beyond what's relevant to these specific claims. Are we clear?" Both lawyers nodded. Judge Brennan looked at Jack for the first time, his gaze direct and assessing. "Mr. Mercer, you understand that winning these judgments, if you win them, is just the beginning? Collecting on them is another matter entirely. They'll appeal. They'll file bankruptcy. They'll hide assets. This could take years and cost you everything you have left. Jack stood, feeling the weight of the room's attention. I understand, Your Honor, but some things are worth the case, not the money, the principle. My grandfather lived his whole life by the principle that a man's word matters, that debts get repaid, that doing the right thing isn't optional just because it's inconvenient. I'm not doing this to get rich. I'm doing it because if I don't, then he lived for nothing. And I can't accept that. Judge Brennan studied him for a long moment, then nodded. Proceed to trial. This hearing is adjourned. He stood and everyone rose with him. As he left the courtroom, Jack saw something that might have been approval in the judge's eyes. Or it might have been nothing, but it felt like something. Outside the courthouse, Clayton Burgess was surrounded by reporters from 3 newspapers and a TV station from Lincoln. He was calm, controlled, playing the victim with practiced ease. This is a shakedown, pure and simple. Jack Mercer is a troubled man trying to exploit his grandfather's papers to extort money from successful members of this community. We'll fight this at trial and we'll win, because the law doesn't allow people to weaponize old debts for personal vendettas. The reporters ate it up, writing down every word, but one of them, a young woman from the Kearney Herald, walked over to where Jack stood with Frank and Margaret. Mr. Mercer, she said, holding up a recorder. Do you have a response to Mr. Burgess's allegations? Jack looked at her, then at the recorder, then at Clayton across the parking lot. He thought about Sam's letter, about noise and silence, about the choice he'd made. I have nothing to say to reporters, Jack said quietly. I said what needed saying in court. The rest will be decided by a jury. The reporter tried to push. But Mr. Burgess claims you're extorting him, that it was different, and Frank stepped in smoothly. My client has no further comment. All relevant facts will be presented at trial. Thank you. They walked to Frank's car, and as they drove away, Jack looked back at the courthouse. Clayton was still talking to reporters, gesturing broadly, performing outrage. Jack wondered if Clayton believed his own story, if he'd convinced himself that he was the victim, that Sam had somehow wronged him by helping him and then expecting repayment. People had a remarkable capacity for rewriting history when the truth made them uncomfortable. That night, as Jack drove back to the Earthbag house, he noticed headlights following him. Not close, but constant, maintaining distance. When he turned onto the dirt road leading to Sam's property, the headlights continued past, but something about the timing felt deliberate, calculated. Jack parked and sat in his truck for several minutes, watching the road. Nothing, just darkness and the sound of wind through bare branches. He went inside, locked the 3 deadbolts, and tried to shake the feeling that he was being watched. He'd almost convinced himself it was paranoia when he heard the sound. Glass breaking, not inside the house, outside, his truck. Jack grabbed the flashlight and went to the window, careful not to silhouette himself. In the beam of the flashlight, he could see his truck. All 4 tires were slashed, not just flat, shredded. Someone had taken a knife to them with enough force to ensure they couldn't be patched. And on the hood, written in what looked like spray paint, a single word: thief. Jack stood at the window for a long time, the flashlight off now, his eyes adjusting to the darkness. He could call the sheriff. But Deputy Wade Holland would show up, take a report, and do exactly nothing. Might even suggest Jack had done it himself for sympathy. This was a message, a warning. Step back or it gets worse. Jack thought about Sam's letter, about choosing the quiet way, about not giving them the satisfaction of seeing him react. He went back inside, locked the door, and added an entry to his ledger. December 12th, tires slashed, 4 new tires needed, cost approximately $600. Threat escalating. I am not backing down. The next morning, Thomas Wade arrived with his tow truck before Jack could even call. Someone reported seeing suspicious activity out here last night, Thomas said, though his expression made it clear he knew exactly who'd done it. Called it into dispatch. My cousin Wade never bothered to respond. Funny how that works. Thomas looked at the damage and shook his head. I'll tow it to my shop. Get you 4 used tires, good tread. $200 total. You can pay me when you can. Jack wanted to argue, to insist on paying full price, but he'd learned that refusing help was its own kind of pride. And pride was a luxury he couldn't afford. Thank you, he said simply. Thomas nodded. They're scared, Jack. That's why they did this. Men who are winning don't need to slash tires in the middle of the night. They're scared you're going to take everything from them. And they should be, because you've got the law on your side. And more than that, you've got something they don't have. Principle. Jack watched the truck get loaded onto the flatbed. He thought about Sam facing similar harassment 50 years ago. Threats, vandalism, social pressure. And Sam had absorbed it all without retaliating, without going loud, without giving his enemies the ammunition they wanted. The quiet way required endurance, required accepting that sometimes you took the hit and kept moving. By the time Jack got his truck back 2 days later, word had spread about the vandalism. And something unexpected happened. 3 more families came forward privately to settle their debts. Small amounts, 1,500 here, 2,000 there. But what mattered wasn't the money. What mattered was that some people in town were starting to choose sides. And not everyone was choosing Clayton's. The weeks between the hearing and Christmas were the hardest Jack had faced since the fire. The town turned colder in more ways than one. His photograph appeared in the newspaper with an article that called him a cautionary tale about desperation and delusion. Someone spray-painted additional messages on the side of the Earthbag house. Crazy, thief, liar. Jack scrubbed them off without comment. The county cut off his water access, claiming unpaid fees, even though Frank proved the account was current. It was harassment, pure and simple, but proving it and stopping it were different things. Jack hauled water from the Earthbag house well in 5-gallon buckets. He washed his clothes in a metal tub with water heated on the wood stove. He bathed once a week using a camp shower he'd rigged from a garbage bag with holes poked in the bottom. It was primitive and exhausting, and exactly what his grandfather had done for 50 years. He began to understand that the Earthbag house wasn't just shelter. It was a test, a constant reminder that comfort was a luxury and survival was a choice you made every single day. Some mornings, Jack woke up and didn't want to get out of bed. The cold was too bitter. The work was too hard. The loneliness too complete. Those mornings, he'd look at Matt's photograph, now hanging on the wall beside Sam's, and he'd ask himself what his son would think if he could see his father now. Living in a dirt house, eating rice and beans, fighting a legal battle he'd probably lose. And every time he asked that question, the answer was the same. Matt would understand. Matt had gone to Afghanistan knowing he might not come back, knowing the mission was bigger than his comfort or his fear. He'd gone because it was the right thing to do, even when the right thing was hard. Jack could do no less. Christmas came and went with little acknowledgement. Father Quinn brought Jack a meal on Christmas Eve, roast chicken and potatoes and pie that Margaret had made. They ate together in the Earthbag house by lantern light, and Quinn said grace over food that tasted better than anything Jack had eaten in months. After dinner, they sat in silence for a long time, the kind of silence that didn't need filling. Finally, Quinn spoke. Your grandfather spent every Christmas alone for 49 years. After your grandmother died, he couldn't stomach the holiday. Too many memories, too much expectation that he should be happy when happiness felt impossible. But he told me once that loneliness and aloneness were different things. Loneliness was lack. Aloneness was choice. Out here, he was alone, but not lonely, because he'd chosen the solitude. And in that choice, he found something most people never find: peace with himself. Jack thought about that, about the difference between being abandoned and choosing solitude, about whether he'd chosen this or had it forced upon him. Maybe the answer was both. Maybe choice and circumstance tangled together so thoroughly that separating them was impossible. Do you think he was happy? Jack asked. Quinn considered the question seriously. I think he was content, which is rarer than happiness and longer lasting. Happiness depends on circumstances. Contentment depends on acceptance. Sam accepted what he'd done in the war, what he'd lost after, what he'd become. Not everyone can do that. The new year arrived without celebration. Jack marked it in his ledger with a simple entry. January 1st, 2020, still standing, still fighting, still here. The trial date approached with the inexorable weight of fate. Frank prepared Jack for testimony, coaching him on how to answer questions, how to stay calm under cross-examination, how to present himself to a jury. Wear the borrowed suit again. Speak clearly but not defensively. Tell the truth without embellishment. Let the documents speak. Don't let them make you angry. Jack practiced in the mirror, watching his own face, trying to see what a jury would see. A 52-year-old man with lines carved deep around his eyes and mouth, gray in his hair that hadn't been there 2 years ago, hands scarred from labor and loss. He looked like what he was, a survivor. The question was whether that would be enough. 3 days before the trial, something unexpected happened. Richard Voss called Frank Dalton's office and asked for a meeting, not with lawyers, just with Jack. Frank was immediately suspicious. It could be a trap, Frank said. Record you saying something they can use against you. Intimidation. I don't know. But Jack wanted to hear what Voss had to say. They met at a diner 30 miles out of town, far enough that no one would recognize them. Voss arrived alone, looking smaller than Jack remembered. His suit was off the rack, not tailored. His face was pale and drawn. He sat across from Jack in a booth by the window and didn't order anything except coffee he didn't drink. I can't pay what your grandfather claimed I owe, Voss said without preamble. I don't have it. The bank salary isn't what people think. My daughter's medical bills didn't stop after that first surgery. She's had 3 more over the years. I'm drowning in debt just like you. Jack studied him, looking for the lie, but all he saw was exhaustion. Then why fight the claim, Jack asked. Why not work out a payment plan? Because Clayton told me I had to. Voss rubbed his face with both hands. He said if any of us settled with you, it would make the rest of us look guilty. Said we had to present a united front or you'd pick us off one by one. He said his lawyers could make this go away if we all stuck together. And you believed him, Jack asked. Voss laughed bitterly. I didn't have a choice. Clayton owns my mortgage. When I bought my house 5 years ago, the bank wouldn't approve me. Clayton co-signed. He holds paper on half the people in this county. You cross him, he calls your loans. You end up losing everything. He paused, looking out the window at nothing. I'm not a bad man, Jack. I know that's what you think, but I'm not. When your grandfather lent me that money, I cried. I was so grateful. I fully intended to pay him back. But then my daughter needed another surgery, and another, and the insurance fought every claim. And I had to choose between paying Sam Mercer and keeping my daughter alive. I chose my daughter. I'd choose her again. Jack sat back, processing this. It didn't excuse the debt, but it complicated the narrative, made Voss less villain and more victim of his own circumstances. And Clayton? Jack asked. He doesn't have the same excuse. Voss shook his head. Clayton's different. He could pay what he owes tomorrow and not even notice the money. But it's not about money for him. It's about pride, about not admitting he needed help, about maintaining the story that he built everything himself through hard work and smart decisions. If he pays you, that story falls apart. And Clayton would rather burn the whole county down than admit he's not self-made. Voss leaned forward, his voice dropping. I'm telling you this because you deserve to know what you're up against. Clayton's planning something. I don't know what, but he's been meeting with people, making calls. He's not going to let you win this, Jack. Even if the jury rules in your favor, he'll find a way to make sure you never collect. Be careful. He stood to leave, threw a 20 on the table for coffee. Neither of them had drunk, and walked out. Jack sat there for another 10 minutes watching the parking lot, thinking about what Voss had said, about Clayton's pride, about the difference between can't pay and won't pay, about the trap that was closing around him and whether he was walking into it with his eyes open, or if he'd been inside it all along. That night, Jack sat in the Earthbag house with Sam's letters spread across the table. He reread the one from Okinawa, the one about killing the Japanese boy, the one about how survival and living were different things. He reread the final letter Sam had left for him, the one that said, loud men die first and quiet men endure. He thought about his grandfather building this house in the aftermath of his son's death, using earth and time as therapy and fortress. Both. Thought about Sam lending money to Clayton and Voss and all the others, not as business, but as penance, trying to save fathers the way he'd killed one, trying to create life the way war had taught him to end it. And Jack understood something he hadn't before. Sam hadn't stayed silent because he was weak or afraid or crazy. He'd stayed silent because he'd learned in the Pacific that some battles can't be won with violence, that some enemies can only be defeated by outlasting them. That patience is the longest-range weapon ever invented. The trial would happen. Jack would tell the truth. The jury would decide. But regardless of outcome, Jack had already won the only fight that mattered. He'd chosen the kind of man he wanted to be, and that choice, once made, couldn't be taken from him by any verdict or any enemy. He locked the Earthbag house and walked outside into the January cold. The stars were sharp and bright overhead, undimmed by any human light for miles. The prairie stretched around him in all directions, empty and patient and older than any human conflict. Jack stood there until his breath stopped making clouds and his body adjusted to the temperature. Then he went back inside, added wood to the stove, and slept the dreamless sleep of a man who'd finally stopped running from his own ghosts. The trial would begin in 3 days, and Jack Mercer was ready. The trial began on a Tuesday morning when the temperature was 8 degrees and the courthouse steps were slick with ice that no one had bothered to salt. Jack arrived early with Frank Dalton, both men carrying boxes of documents that represented a lifetime of careful record-keeping and the hope that truth still mattered in a courtroom. The jury had been selected the day before. 12 people, 8 men and 4 women, ranging in age from 32 to 71, farmers and teachers and small business owners, people who understood debt and struggle and what it meant when someone's word was the only currency they had. Judge Brennan took the bench at 9 sharp, and the courtroom rose as one. When everyone settled, the judge looked at both tables with the expression of a man who'd refereed too many fights between neighbors and knew how most of them ended, badly and with no one really winning. The trial would last 3 days. Frank had warned Jack it could stretch longer if Clayton's lawyers tried to bury them in procedural delays. But Judge Brennan had made it clear he wouldn't tolerate games. The facts were simple. Either the contracts were valid or they weren't. Either the debts existed or they didn't. Everything else was noise. Frank's opening statement was brief and factual. He held up Sam's ledgers like they were scripture. "These books," Frank said, walking slowly in front of the jury box, "represent 50 years of a man's life." Samuel Mercer served his country in World War II. He came home to Nebraska and built a farm and a family. When his son died in Vietnam, something broke in him. Not his mind, his hope. He moved into a house he'd built with his own hands, a house everyone laughed at, and he spent the next 50 years trying to repay a debt he felt he owed to the world. He lent money to people in crisis, farmers facing foreclosure, families with medical emergencies, people who had nowhere else to turn. He asked for repayment not because he was greedy, but because he believed a man's word mattered. Some people paid him back, most tried, but some took his help, built successful lives on it, and then pretended the help never happened. My client, Jack Mercer, Sam's grandson, is here to collect what his grandfather was owed. Not for profit, for principle. Because if we don't honor our debts, then we don't honor anything. Marcus Weaver's opening was longer and more theatrical. He painted Sam as a predator who'd taken advantage of desperate people. He called the contracts unconscionable. He suggested that Sam had been mentally unstable, that his record-keeping was the obsession of a disturbed mind, that enforcing these ancient agreements would set a dangerous precedent that would destroy the fabric of community trust. It was a good performance, Jack had to admit. Weaver knew how to work a room, knew which words would make people uncomfortable with the idea of holding someone accountable for something they'd done 30 years ago. But as Jack watched the jury, he saw something Weaver missed. Half of them weren't buying it. They'd seen the ledgers. They'd heard that Sam had been a Marine, had survived Okinawa, had lived simply and quietly for half a century. These were people who understood that living in an unusual house didn't make you crazy. It just made you different. And different wasn't the same as wrong. The first witness Frank called was Margaret Chen. She took the stand wearing a simple dress and the dignity of someone who'd survived loss and come out stronger. Frank asked her about the loan Sam had made to her in 2001. Margaret answered clearly, without embellishment. She described her husband's death, her 3 children, the grocery store she didn't know how to run alone. She described Sam appearing at her door with a check and a simple statement. "Pay me back when you can. If you can't, pay someone else forward someday." She described repaying the loan in full, then learning years later that Sam had given the money back through an anonymous church donation designated for her children's education. When Frank asked her why she thought Sam had done that, Margaret's answer was simple and devastating. Because he understood that pride and charity are enemies. He let me repay him so I could keep my pride. Then he helped my children so they could have chances I couldn't give them. That's not predatory lending. That's grace. Marcus Weaver tried to shake her testimony on cross-examination, suggesting she was biased because Jack was her friend. Margaret looked at him with the patience of a woman who'd raised 3 children and dealt with worse than hostile lawyers. I'm not here because Jack Mercer is my friend, she said. I'm here because Sam Mercer helped me when no one else would, and because the truth matters more than comfort. The second day brought Richard Voss to the stand, but not as a defendant, as a witness for the plaintiff. Jack hadn't known Frank was going to call him until that morning. Voss looked sick as he took the oath, his hands shaking on the Bible. Frank was gentle with him, asking about the loan, about his daughter's surgery, about why he'd stopped making payments. Voss told the truth, all of it, about his daughter's ongoing medical needs, about Clayton Burgess pressuring him to fight the claim, about Clayton holding mortgages on half the defendants and threatening to call them if anyone broke ranks. He described a system of control that Clayton had built over decades, using his wealth to keep people dependent and quiet. By the time Voss finished testifying, 3 members of the jury were taking notes, and Clayton's face had gone from red to purple. Weaver tried to discredit Voss on cross-examination, but the damage was done. The jury had seen a man confess his failings and explain his reasons. They'd seen someone who couldn't pay distinguish himself from someone who wouldn't pay. And they'd heard for the first time that this wasn't really about old debts. It was about power and control and one man's refusal to admit he'd needed help. On the third day Jack took the stand, Frank led him through his background, the farm, the marriage, the son who died in Afghanistan, the wife who died of cancer, the slow collapse of everything he'd built. Jack spoke quietly, answering each question without elaboration, the way Frank had coached him. But when Frank asked why he was pursuing these claims, Jack looked directly at the jury and spoke from somewhere deeper than preparation. My grandfather survived a war that killed 50 million people, Jack said. He came home and tried to build a life, but the war followed him. He spent 50 years trying to make up for what he'd had to do to survive. He helped people because he understood what it meant to need help. He kept records because he understood that memory matters. That documentation is how we honor the past and protect the future. When he died, he left me those records and a choice. I could use them to destroy people. He'd given me the tools for that. Evidence of crimes and failures and things people wanted kept secret. Or I could use them to ask for what was simply owed. Not revenge, just honesty. Just the acknowledgement that help was given and debts were made. I chose the second path, not because it's easier. It's not. I've lost my house, my cattle, my equipment. I've been called crazy and desperate and a dozen other things. But I haven't lost myself. And that's worth more than any amount of money. Marcus Weaver's cross-examination was aggressive, but Jack was ready. Weaver tried to paint him as mentally unstable, bringing up the drinking, the isolation, the fact that Jack was living in what Weaver called a hovel made of dirt. Jack didn't flinch. I'm 3 years sober, he said. I attend AA meetings in Cozad every Thursday. My sponsor's in the gallery, if you want to verify that. As for the Earthbag house, it's not a hovel. It's a home my grandfather built to last. It stood for 50 years, and it'll stand for 50 more. That's more than I can say for most modern construction. When Weaver suggested that Jack was pursuing these claims out of bitterness and financial desperation, Jack's answer was the same one he'd given Judge Brennan. Some things are worth the cost. My grandfather taught me that. Not through words, through how he lived. He could have destroyed Clayton Burgess and the others any time in the last 30 years. He had evidence that would have sent some of them to prison. But he didn't use it, because that wasn't the fight he was having. He was fighting to prove that the quiet way still works, that patience outlasts rage, that silence is stronger than noise. I'm just trying to finish what he started. The closing arguments happened on a Friday afternoon with snow falling outside the courthouse windows. Frank spoke first, his voice carrying the weight of 40 years practicing law in a place where everyone knew everyone's business and secrets were currency. This case, Frank said, standing in front of the jury without notes or theatrics, is simple. Contracts were signed, money was lent, repayment was promised. Some people honored those promises, others didn't. The question before you isn't complicated. Do signed contracts mean something or don't they? Does a man's word have value or doesn't it? The defendants want you to believe that time erases obligation, that if you ignore a debt long enough, it disappears, that if you build success on borrowed money, you get to keep that success even if you never repay the loan. But that's not how the law works. And it's not how civilization works. We survive as communities because we honor our agreements, because we remember who helped us, because we understand that taking without giving back is just theft with better marketing. Sam Mercer was many things: unconventional, private, scarred by war and loss. But he wasn't a predator. He was a man who tried to help and asked only to be remembered. The defendants forgot him. That's their right, but it doesn't erase what they owe. Weaver's closing was polished and passionate, arguing that enforcing these old contracts would open floodgates to frivolous claims and destroy the social fabric that held small communities together. He called Jack a man driven by grief to wage a crusade that his grandfather never wanted. He painted Clayton and the others as victims of an obsessive old man's revenge fantasy executed from beyond the grave. It was compelling in the way falsehoods often are when delivered with confidence. But Jack watched the jury, and he saw skepticism, saw people who'd lived long enough to know when someone was trying to sell them something. Judge Brennan gave his jury instructions with the weariness of a man who'd seen every variation of human conflict and found most of it predictable. "You are not here to decide if these debts should be forgiven," he told them. "You are here to decide if they exist, if the contracts are valid, if the collateral is properly described, if the defendants are in default." Those are questions of fact and law, not sympathy. You may not like that Samuel Mercer kept records for 50 years. You may think he should have pursued these claims when they were fresh, but your personal opinions about his choices are not relevant. What's relevant is whether the contracts meet legal requirements for enforcement. If they do, the debts are owed. If they don't, they're not. It's that simple. The jury deliberated for 7 hours. Jack spent that time in the Earthbag house, alone, unable to sit still or sleep or do anything but walk circles in the small space while his mind played through every possible outcome. When Frank called just after 6 in the evening to say the jury had reached a verdict, Jack's hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the phone. The courtroom was packed when they reconvened. More people than had attended the trial, drawn by the news that a verdict was imminent. Jack sat at the plaintiff's table and stared straight ahead, his face expressionless, as the jury filed in. None of them looked at him. He'd been told that was a bad sign, but he didn't let himself interpret it, didn't let himself hope or fear or feel anything except the moment. Judge Brennan asked the foreperson, a woman in her 60s who ran a feed store in Elm Creek, if the jury had reached a verdict. "We have, Your Honor." The foreperson handed a paper to the bailiff, who handed it to the judge. Brennan read it without expression, then looked up. "On the claim against Clayton Burgess, how do you find?" "We find for the plaintiff. Contract valid. Debt owed. Amount $340,000 plus court costs." "On the claim against Richard Voss, how do you find?" "We find for the plaintiff. Contract valid. But we recommend the court consider a payment plan given the defendant's demonstrated financial hardship." "On the claim against Dr. Helen Strauss, how do you find?" "We find for the plaintiff. Contract valid. Debt owed. Amount $78,000 plus court costs." The verdict continued through all 7 defendants. 6 guilty, 1 dismissed for lack of clear documentation. Total amount awarded, $567,000. The courtroom erupted. Clayton Burgess stood and started shouting something about appeals and corruption. But Judge Brennan's gavel cracked like a gunshot and silence fell instantly. "Mr. Burgess, sit down or I'll hold you in contempt. This is still my courtroom." Clayton sat, his face twisted with rage. Jack felt nothing. Not triumph, not relief, just a kind of emptiness. Like he'd been holding his breath 4 months and finally let it out only to discover he didn't know how to breathe normally anymore. Judge Brennan set a hearing date for 30 days out to determine payment terms and enforcement mechanisms. He warned both sides that appeals would be expensive and likely unsuccessful given the strength of the evidence. Then he adjourned, and everyone stood as he left. Outside, reporters mobbed Jack, shouting questions he didn't answer. Frank ran interference, issuing a brief statement about justice served and the importance of honoring contracts, while Jack walked to his truck and drove away before anyone could follow. He went to the Earthbag house and sat in the dark for a long time. He'd won, legally, factually, $567,000, more than enough to pay off his debts, rebuild his farm, start over. But Voss's warning echoed in his mind. Clayton would find a way to make sure Jack never collected. Even winning might not mean anything. 2 weeks later, Jack understood what Voss had meant. Clayton Burgess filed for bankruptcy, Chapter 13, reorganization which would protect his assets while he restructured his debts. The bankruptcy court would decide how much of the judgment Jack could collect, and bankruptcy judges had wide discretion to reduce amounts owed. Frank estimated Jack might get 30 cents on the dollar, maybe less. DeSuros did the same thing. So did Mayor Kern. 3 others settled for pennies, offering lump sum payments of $10,000 to $15,000 each in exchange for releasing all claims. Only Richard Voss kept his word, working out a payment plan with Frank that would take 12 years but would eventually pay the full amount. Jack could have fought the bankruptcies, could have hired lawyers to argue that the debts weren't dischargeable because they were secured, but that would cost money he didn't have and time he couldn't spare. Frank laid out the options over coffee at the Earthbag house, his expression grim. "You won the battle, Jack, but they're winning the war. If you take the settlements, you'll get maybe 100,000 total, enough to clear your farm debt and have a little left over. Not enough to rebuild, not enough to make this worth what it cost you." Jack thought about that number. $100,000. His grandfather had been owed more than $600,000, and Jack would collect a sixth of it, a 16% return on 50 years of patience. It would have been funny if it wasn't so bitter. "What would Sam do?" Jack asked. Frank set down his coffee cup and looked at Jack for a long time. Sam would take it, take the money, clear the debts, and move on. Because Sam understood something most people don't. Winning isn't about getting everything you're owed. It's about getting enough to survive and keeping your soul intact. You've already won the real fight, Jack. You proved the contracts were valid. You proved your grandfather wasn't crazy. You proved that the quiet way works, even when the results aren't perfect. Take the money, save your farm, live your life. Let them live with what they did. That's a heavier sentence than any court can impose. So Jack took the settlements, all of them, signed the releases, deposited the checks, $104,000 after legal fees. He paid off First National Bank's accelerated loan on the farm. $78,000. That left him with $26,000. He used $10,000 to buy a used tractor, not new but functional, and basic tools to work the land again. He used $5,000 to repair critical infrastructure, fencing and irrigation. The remaining $11,000 went into a bank account he swore he'd only touch for emergencies. The farm was saved, barely, but saved. By spring, Jack was planting again. Not the full 680 acres, he couldn't manage that alone, but 100 acres of wheat and another 100 of corn, enough to generate income and occupy his days. He hired help during harvest, paying Thomas Wade's nephew and 2 high school kids from town who needed summer work. The earth remembered how to grow things even when Jack had forgotten. The wheat came up green and strong. The corn followed. By July, the fields looked like they might actually produce enough to justify the seed cost and the hours Jack put in. He still lived in the Earthbag house, not because he had to anymore, but because he'd discovered something there. Peace, the kind that comes from having walls around you that you understand completely. From heating with wood, you cut yourself. From water you pump by hand. From simplicity that clarifies everything. People in town still talked about him, but the tone had shifted. The trial had changed something. Jack wasn't the crazy man harassing good citizens anymore. He was the man who'd stood up to power, and power had blinked. Even if the victory was incomplete, the fact that he'd stood at all mattered. Margaret Chen told him that one day when he stopped by her store for supplies. "People respect what you did," she said, bagging his purchases. "Not everyone understands it, but they respect it. You didn't back down. You didn't go loud. You did it the way your grandfather would have. That means something." Father Quinn visited every few weeks, and they'd sit outside the Earthbag house and talk about nothing important. Quinn was getting older, moving slower, and he'd told Jack he was thinking about retirement. "Who'll take your place?" Jack asked one evening as they watched the sunset over the prairie. Quinn shrugged. "God will provide. He always does. Might not be who we expect. Might not even be a priest. Sometimes the next generation finds its own way to serve." He looked at Jack meaningfully. "You ever think about what comes after the farm? After you're gone? Who gets this place?" Jack hadn't thought about it. He had no children. Matt was gone. Karen was gone. He was the last Mercer. When he died, the farm would be sold, the Earthbag house probably torn down, and everything Sam had built would disappear like it had never existed. Unless. The idea came slowly, but once it arrived, it felt inevitable. Jack met with Frank Dalton in his office and laid out a plan. "I want to put the farm in a trust, like Sam did with his land parcels. Set it up so it can't be sold, only leased. Long-term, affordable leases to young farmers who need a start. People the banks won't touch. People like I was." Frank listened, taking notes. "That's complicated. You'd need a board to manage it. Need clear terms about who qualifies. Need funding for maintenance and administration." "I know," Jack said. "But it's possible, right?" "It's possible. What about the Earthbag house?" Jack had thought about that too. The house becomes an education center. Agricultural training, financial literacy, veterans programs. Teach people how to survive when the world says they can't. How to live quiet when everything's loud. How to last. Frank worked for 6 months setting up the structure. The Samuel and Jack Mercer Agricultural Trust. Established 226. Assets, 680 acres, one Earthbag house, 115,000 in combined funds from settlements and careful savings. Trustees, Margaret Chen, Father Quinn, Thomas Wade, Frank Dalton, and Jack Mercer. Purpose, to provide affordable land access and education to farmers and veterans, demonstrating financial need and commitment to sustainable agriculture. Preference given to those rejected by traditional lending institutions. By Jack's 53rd birthday, the trust was operational. The first lease went to a young couple from Grand Island, both in their 20s, both from farming families that had lost their land in the 2008 crisis. They moved into a small house on the North Quarter and started working 100 acres of the trust land. 50-year lease, $500 annual rent. Option to buy after 20 years at a price locked to 2026 land values. Jack watched them work and saw himself 30 years ago. Saw Matt as a child running through fields that seemed infinite. Saw possibilities. The Earthbag House program started small. A weekend workshop on farm financial planning taught by Frank and a retired banker who'd known Sam. 8 people attended, then a veterans group that met every other Thursday, guys from Iraq and Afghanistan and Vietnam, all of them trying to figure out how to live in a world that felt too loud and too fast. Jack facilitated but mostly listened, learning that his story wasn't unique, that trauma was democracy, that survival was a skill you could teach if you were patient enough. By the second year, the programs had grown, monthly workshops, a partnership with the community college for credit courses, guest speakers on everything from soil conservation to PTSD management. The Earthbag House, the joke structure that everyone had mocked, became the unlikely center of something real. Proof that strange foundations could support important things if you gave them time. Jack was 54 when Margaret Chen knocked on his door one evening with a young man in tow. "This is David Cole," she said. "Veteran, Afghanistan, having a rough time, needs work and a place to figure things out. I told him you might have both." David was 28, thin and haunted looking, with the specific kind of quiet that came from seeing things you couldn't unsee. Jack recognized it instantly. Recognized himself. They shook hands, and Jack saw the scars on David's wrists. Old scars. Not fresh, but there. David stayed, first for a week, then a month, then indefinitely. Jack gave him the spare room in the education center addition they'd built onto the Earthbag house. Gave him work maintaining the grounds, helping with programs, learning the rhythms of the land. Slowly over months, David started talking about Kandahar, about the IED that killed his best friend, about coming home to find that home didn't feel like home anymore, about the night he tried to end it and failed, about the years since, drifting from job to job, place to place, unable to land anywhere. Jack listened and shared his own story, not as therapy, just as fact. Told David about Matt, about Karen, about the night he'd sat in the Earthbag house with a loaded gun and heard his son's voice telling him not to. Told him about Sam in Okinawa and the Japanese boy with the grenade. Told him that survival wasn't the same as living, but that sometimes survival was enough to start with. David worked and healed and learned. Jack taught him to manage the trust properties, to handle the finances, to run the education programs. 2 years after arriving, David enrolled in online courses for nonprofit management. 3 years after that, he was essentially running the trust while Jack worked the fields and taught occasional workshops. On Jack's 58th birthday, he and David sat outside the Earthbag house on the bench that had become a place for important conversations. David had something on his mind. Jack could see it in the way he kept starting to speak and then stopping. Finally, David just asked, "Why me? Why take me in? You didn't know me, didn't owe me anything. You could have sent me away." Jack thought about that, about Sam helping Clayton and Margaret and all the others, about the ledgers and the patience and the 50 years of trying to repay a debt to a dead Japanese soldier. "Because someone took me in when I needed it," Jack said. "My grandfather left me a house and a choice. I made the choice. Part of that choice is doing for others what was done for me. Not because it's noble, because it's necessary. We survive by helping each other survive." David nodded slowly. "I want to stay. Permanently. I want to help run this place. Make it bigger. Help more people. I know I'm still figuring things out, but this feels right. It feels like home." Jack felt something in his chest that might have been pride, or might have been grief, or might have been both. Those feelings tangled together so thoroughly now that he couldn't separate them anymore. "You've been home?" Jack said. "You just didn't know it yet." The years passed. The farm produced. The trust grew. 6 families leasing land by 2030, 12 families by 2032. The Earthbag House programs expanded to serve 3 counties. David took over most of the administrative work, and Jack settled into the role of elder advisor, the old man who'd fought the fight and could tell you how it went. He was 63 when Father Quinn died, peacefully, in his sleep, the way everyone hopes to go. Jack spoke at the funeral, talking about a man who'd understood that faith was action, that service was silence, that the best priests were the ones who showed up when you needed them and didn't make a big deal about it. After the service, the new priest, a woman in her 40s named Sarah Martinez, asked Jack if he'd consider serving on the parish council. "We need people who remember what this community used to be," she said, "who can help us figure out what it should become." Jack served, not because he was religious, but because our Quinn would have wanted him to, because showing up mattered. Clayton Burgess died in 2033 at the age of 72. Heart attack, massive and instant. He'd been arguing with his lawyer about the trust acquiring land adjacent to his when it happened. Jack didn't attend the funeral, but he read the obituary. It listed Clayton's business accomplishments, his community service, his 3 daughters. It mentioned that he was a self-made man who'd built a successful farming operation through hard work and determination. It didn't mention Sam Mercer. Didn't mention the $85,000 that had saved him from bankruptcy in 1989. The story Clayton told himself had become the story everyone remembered. But Jack knew the truth. That was enough. Dr. Strauss retired and moved to Arizona. Richard Voss made his final payment to the trust in 2034, a check for $430 that completed the 12-year payment plan he'd committed to. He delivered it in person, shaking Jack's hand, and said simply, "I'm sorry it took so long. But I kept my word." Jack didn't argue, just accepted the check and filed it away. The debt was settled. By 2035, Jack was 65 and slowing down. His back ached from decades of farm work. His hands were stiff in the mornings. He still lived in the Earthbag house, still preferred its simplicity to anything modern. But David had taken over most of the day-to-day operations of both the farm and the trust, and Jack found himself with time to sit and think and remember. He thought about Sam often, wondered if his grandfather would approve of what the Earthbag house had become, a place of teaching rather than hiding, a fortress opened rather than sealed. Jack hoped Sam would understand that you could honor the quiet way while still inviting people in. That silence didn't require solitude. that you could be still and strong and present all at once. On a morning in May, when the wheat was just starting to turn from green to gold, Jack walked the property with David, showed him the boundaries, explained the history of each parcel, pointed out where Sam had first stacked the earth bags that became the house, where Jack had burned the bodies of his dead cattle, where Matt used to play as a child. They stopped at the Earthbag house, and Jack sat on the bench while David stood, hands in pockets, looking at the strange structure. "It still looks like it shouldn't be standing," David said. "But here it is, 57 years, still here." Jack smiled. "That's the point. Things that look weak can be strong if they're built right." Sam understood that, built this place to prove it, built a whole system to prove it. Patience, discipline, silence. Those aren't weaknesses. They're the foundation everything else rests on. David sat beside him. "What happens when you're gone?" "Someone else carries it. You. Someone after you. The house doesn't care who lives in it. It just keeps standing. That's its job." Jack paused. "There's something I need to tell you. I'm updating my will. When I die, my share of the trust goes to you. All of it. You'll be the primary trustee, responsible for keeping this going." David's eyes went wide. "Jack, I can't. I'm not. That's too much." "You're ready," Jack said. "You've been ready for years. You understand what this place is for. Not about money or land or winning. About giving people chances. About quiet strength. About proving that the old ways still work if you're patient enough to let them. You've lived it. Now you'll lead it." They sat in silence for a long time, watching the wind move through the wheat like water. Finally, David asked, "How will I know I'm doing it right?" "The same way Sam knew. The same way I knew. You won't. You'll just do your best and document it and hope the next person understands." That's how legacy works. It's not about being perfect. It's about being true. Jack Mercer died in his sleep on a November morning in 2038, 3 days after his 68th birthday. He went peacefully, lying in the same cot his grandfather had slept in the house that had sheltered 3 generations of broken men learning how to be whole. David found him when he came by with morning coffee and knew immediately. There was no struggle, no pain, just silence. The funeral was held at St. Catherine's. 400 people attended. Every family in the trust, every veteran from the programs, people from 3 counties who'd been touched by Sam's original kindness or Jack's continuation of it. Father Martinez said Jack had lived a life of quiet service, that he'd honored his grandfather by refusing to fight the way the world expected, that he'd won by redefining what winning meant. Margaret Chen, 91 years old and still running her grocery store, spoke about the day Sam had saved her life and the day Jack had proven that salvation could be passed forward. Thomas Wade, now retired and gray, talked about Jack giving him purpose when he'd felt purposeless. And David Cole, 39 years old and steady in a way he'd never been before Jack, stood at the podium and told the story of the Earthbag house, of how it had been built by a man haunted by war, of how it had sheltered a man destroyed by loss, of how it had taught a man drowning in trauma how to breathe again. "The house still stands," David said, "will stand for decades more, not because it's beautiful, because it's true, because it was built by someone who understood that the strongest foundations are the ones you can't see." Sam built it from earth and time. Jack filled it with purpose. And all of us, everyone here, were part of what it became. A place where quiet strength teaches loud people how to listen, where patience defeats hurry, where silence speaks louder than any noise. After the funeral, David returned to the Earthbag house alone. He sat at the table where Sam had kept his ledgers and Jack had read them. The walls pressed in around him, familiar and solid and eternal. He opened the ledger he'd been keeping for the past 5 years, his own record, names of people helped, families given leases, veterans finding their way. He added one final entry. Jack Mercer, died November 15, 2038, paid in full. Below it he wrote, "The inheritance continues." Then David locked the house and hid the key under the flat stone outside, the way Sam had, the way Jack had. He walked away knowing he'd be back tomorrow, and the day after, and every day until he couldn't walk anymore. Because the Earthbag house didn't belong to him. He belonged to it. The way Jack had, the way Sam had, the way whoever came after David would belong to it too. The structure stood in the fading light, rough and weathered and imperfect, exactly what it needed to be. And inside, if you listen carefully through those thick earthen walls, you could almost hear three men breathing in rhythm. Sam, Jack, David, past, present, future. All of them quiet, all of them strong, all of them proof that some fortresses aren't built to keep the world out. They're built to keep the truth in. And truth, given enough time and patience and silence, outlasts everything.